There is a version of Family Guy that you have never seen. Not the episodes that air on Wednesday nights, not the reruns that play at 2 in the morning on cable, and not the slightly longer cuts you find on DVD box sets. There is a whole other version of this show living in the spaces between the episodes, scattered across locked editing bays and studio hard drives, and the faded memories of writers who sat in a room 25 years ago and created something that never made it to air. Deleted scenes that got pulled at the last second. Storylines that were pitched, approved, boarded, and then quietly abandoned. Episodes that were fully animated, fully voiced, fully scored, and then shelved because someone somewhere decided the world was not quite ready for them. Moments of genuine television history that most people have never heard of and will probably never get the chance to watch. That is what this is about. Pull up a blanket, get comfortable. Let your eyes go soft if they want to. This is the kind of story best told slowly, in the dark, with nowhere else to be. Because the story of Family Guy's hidden archive is not a quick list of funny moments that got cut for time. It is something richer and stranger than that. It is a story about what a television show actually is when nobody is watching. About the relationship between a creative team and the network that owns what they make. About the dozens of tiny decisions that happen in the invisible hours between when a joke gets written and when it either appears on your screen or disappears forever. About all the roads the show could have taken but did not. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999, right after Super Bowl 33, pulling in around 22 million viewers for that first episode alone. It was a number that reflected less the show's immediate cultural standing and more the simple mathematics of airing directly after the most-watched sporting event in America. But the audience stayed. The show's first season averaged 12.8 million households, enough to land it at number 33 in the Nielsen ratings for that year. By any reasonable measure, this was a hit. And from the very first weeks of production, the writers were generating more material than any broadcast hour could contain. Seth MacFarlane had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design and cut his teeth doing freelance animation work at Hanna-Barbera. He'd written for Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, Dexter's Laboratory. He had spent years learning how to fill time in short, punchy formats. And then he pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in May of 1998, showed them a world built on pop culture references and absurdist cutaway gags, and a family that loved each other in spite of genuinely not understanding each other at all. Fox said yes, and the machine started. When a show like Family Guy goes into production, the volume of material created is staggering. For a single 22-minute episode, writers will generate jokes that could fill twice that runtime. Table reads happen. Certain bits get cut because they slow the pacing. Others get cut because Fox's Standards and Practices Department flags them. Still, others get cut simply because the episode runs long during the final edit and something has to go. Most of that material gets quietly filed away. In the early digital era of the late 1990s and early 2000s, a lot of it got filed in ways that were easy to lose. What makes Family Guy particularly fascinating from an archival perspective is that the show has 3 distinct eras separated by gaps and cancellations. And each era had a different relationship with its own deleted content. The original 3-season run, from 1999 to 2002, produced material that has largely vanished. After the show returned from cancellation in 2005, the DVD market was robust enough that extras and deleted scenes started getting packaged and released for home audiences. And in the decades since, the internet has surfaced fragments of things that were never supposed to exist at all. The Lost Media Wiki, a community-run database dedicated to tracking down media that has gone out of circulation or was never publicly released, has an extensive Family Guy section. And what it reveals is quietly remarkable. The deleted scenes from seasons 4 through the current run were almost always included on DVD releases, made available to fans relatively quickly. But seasons 1 through 3 are a different story entirely. The material from that original run, from the show's creative peak by most accounts, is largely missing. Only 3 deleted scenes from the entire first season have been confirmed to exist in any form, glimpsed briefly in old promotional materials and a behind-the-scenes special. What is almost certainly a much larger body of work has simply never surfaced. Think about what that means for a moment. The era of the show that most people point to when they talk about Family Guy being genuinely great, the era that the transcript we have used as a tonal guide describes as having sharp writing, original characters, and a unique style that stood apart from everything else on television. That is the era with the most missing material. The clever, warm, character-driven version of these characters exists in a body of work where substantial amounts of what was created has either been lost or never released. There are scenes that fans have described from promotional materials and early DVD extras that have since been removed or never re-released in any form. There are jokes that writers have mentioned in interviews that clearly made it deep into the production process and then got pulled. There are entire character beats for the early Stewie, the evil genius version before his gradual transformation, that exist only as descriptions rather than actual footage. This gap in the archive matters because it creates a kind of mythology around the show's golden era. When fans talk about early Family Guy with reverence, they are talking about what they saw. But there was more. There was always more. The show was producing material at a pace that a 22-minute broadcast window could never contain, and the material that got cut in those first 3 seasons has taken on an almost legendary quality precisely because so little of it can be verified. Over the course of this script, we are going to go deep into all of it. The banned episodes and the reasons networks make the decisions they do. The scenes that were pulled at the last moment for reasons ranging from the genuinely sensitive to the utterly baffling. The storylines that got pitched and developed and then abandoned partway through. The mysteries baked into the show's DNA that were never resolved on purpose or by accident. The fan theories that reframe everything you thought you knew about the Griffin family. And the strange, melancholy question of what a show loses when it creates something and then decides the world is not allowed to have it. So, settle in. This one takes a while. And honestly, that is exactly how it should be told. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a genuinely good time because there is a lot more of this kind of thing coming. Section 2. The banned episodes when Fox said no. The most famous thing in Family Guy's censorship history is also the simplest. One episode of the show has never legally aired on American television. Not once. Not in syndication, not on cable, not on streaming. It exists. It was produced, animated, voiced, and scored. It aired in the United Kingdom. It appeared on a Season 8 DVD set that you can find if you look, but on American television, Partial Terms of Endearment is a ghost. A complete, fully realized piece of television that the country that made it has decided for over 15 years now cannot be broadcast here. The episode was written by Danny Smith and directed by Joseph Lee. It was produced during Season 8, and its production code, 7ACX10, places it as one of the last episodes to be presented in the show's old full-screen format before the series switched to widescreen. It aired in the United Kingdom on BBC 3 on the 20th of June 2010. It appeared on the Season 8 DVD set in September of 2010. It has never aired in America. The plot, when summarized plainly, sounds like the premise for an after-school special that never quite got made. Lois reconnects with an old friend from college named Naomi, voiced by Julia Sweeney. Naomi and her husband Dale are unable to conceive, and Naomi asks Lois to act as a surrogate mother. Peter is opposed to this idea, as Peter is generally opposed to most ideas that do not involve beer or watching television. Lois agrees anyway and undergoes in vitro fertilization. Then, before the pregnancy has progressed very far, Naomi and Dale are killed in a car accident. And Lois is left carrying a baby that has no parents and no clear plan, facing a decision about what to do next. The decision she ultimately makes is left somewhat ambiguous in the episode's final cut. The episode does not come down hard on one side of the abortion debate. It presents the question, lets the characters argue about it with varying degrees of intelligence and sincerity, and then allows the situation to resolve in a way that was intentionally designed not to moralize. The writers, according to later interviews, were trying to do something genuinely rare in animation, which is to address a deeply divisive, real-world topic without telling the audience what to think about it. Fox disagreed with the decision to air it. The network not only pulled the episode from its own broadcast schedule, but asked Adult Swim not to run it either. Cartoon Network, which had aired Family Guy reruns on its Adult Swim block and been instrumental in the show's revival from cancellation, honored Fox's request. The episode had nowhere to go in America except onto a DVD that fans had to actively seek out. As of this writing, it is not available to stream on Hulu, which is the current home of the series. It was not included when Family Guy debuted on Disney+. It exists in a legal limbo that has now lasted longer than the show's entire original run before its first cancellation. What is interesting about Partial Terms of Endearment is that it is not, by Family Guy standards, an especially outrageous piece of television. It does not contain graphic violence. It does not have the kind of shock value humor that the show would deploy heavily in later seasons. It is actually a relatively restrained episode for a show that has, in various other episodes, shown characters dying in detailed and gory ways, made jokes about every conceivable sensitive topic, and broadcast content that drew hundreds of formal complaints to the Federal Communications Commission. The thing that scared Fox was not the execution, but the subject matter. Abortion is one of those topics where American broadcast television has historically decided that any treatment, however careful, carries more risk than reward. MacFarlane was characteristically direct about the decision. He said at various points that he felt the episode was one of the better ones the show had produced in that period, and that Fox's refusal to air it was frustrating. He noted the irony that the network was willing to broadcast dozens of episodes that drew FCC complaints and public controversy while drawing the line at an episode that was arguably more thoughtful than most of what they aired. The episode remains the clearest example of how the relationship between a show's creative team and the network that broadcasts it is never purely about quality. It is about risk calculation. It is about which controversies a company is willing to absorb and which ones it would rather avoid entirely. Before Partial Terms of Endearment took that title, there was another episode that Family Guy fans knew as the banned one. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was produced in the year 2000 as part of the show's second season, given the production code 2ACX05. It was scheduled to air on Fox, and then, right before it was supposed to air, Fox's executives got cold feet. The episode follows Peter, who is convinced that he needs a Jewish person to help him manage the family's finances after being conned out of money by a Volcano insurance salesman. He befriends a Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein, voiced by Peter Riegert. The episode features a musical number called I Need a Jew, which is a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star from the Pinocchio film. And the episode concludes with Peter attempting to have Chris converted to Judaism, reasoning that being Jewish will give his son the financial acumen Peter believes Jewish people universally possess. Fox's concern was that the episode's reliance on Jewish stereotypes, even in the context of a satirical comedy built on lampooning Peter's ignorance and prejudice, crossed a line into potential anti-Semitism. The network pulled it from the schedule without giving it an air date. It sat in a drawer for 3 years. During that time, Family Guy was canceled, resurrected through DVD sales and Adult Swim ratings, and renewed for a 4th season. And When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was eventually aired, first on Adult Swim in November 2003, and then on Fox in December 2004, nearly 4 years after it was produced. MacFarlane, introducing it during an Adult Swim broadcast, made a joke about Fox's decision, saying the network had described the episode as too risky, and that in his experience, too risky from a network executive usually meant anything that did not involve Paris Hilton on the hood of a car. The irony is that when audiences actually saw the episode, the overwhelming reaction was that it was not especially controversial at all. It is a sharp parody of Peter's ignorance. Max Weinstein, the Jewish character at the center of the episode, is portrayed with warmth and dignity. The joke is not that Jewish people are a certain way. The joke is that Peter is a certain way, and that his understanding of the world around him is comically, painfully limited. Critics who reviewed the episode when it finally aired generally found it to be one of the better episodes of the early run rather than a particularly dangerous piece of satire. The lawsuit that followed was, in some ways, more consequential than the original controversy. The music publishing company Born Co., which owns the rights to When You Wish Upon a Star, sued Fox and the show's producers in 2007, arguing that I Need a Jew was a copyright infringement rather than a protected parody. The case went to federal court. In March 2009, United States District Judge Deborah Batts ruled in Fox's favor, finding that the parody was sufficiently transformative and that the original song was fair game for this kind of comedic treatment. The ruling was a significant victory, not just for Family Guy, but for the broader principle that parody is protected even when it makes people uncomfortable. Then there is Turban Cowboy, which occupied a stranger and more troubling space in the show's censorship history. The episode aired. It was not pulled before broadcast. It ran on Fox on the 17th of March 2013, during the show's 11th season. The story follows Peter befriending a Muslim man named Mahmoud, who he eventually discovers is planning an attack. The episode contained a cutaway gag in which Peter plows his car through the Boston Marathon, knocking down runners. On the 15th of April 2013, less than a month after the episode aired, 2 bombs exploded near the finish line of the Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds more. The episode was immediately pulled from streaming services. Fox removed it from its online platforms. It was not included in cable reruns. A clip of the episode that had circulated online, showing the Boston Marathon sequence, went viral in a deeply unsettling context, with some viewers initially mistaking it for something connected to the actual attack before the dates clarified the situation. The episode has never fully returned to regular rotation, though it has appeared on DVD releases and has been acknowledged as a part of the show's official episode count, the AV. Club's review at the time of original broadcast gave it a grade of D, calling it an episode that felt like it had been written a decade earlier and left to develop mold, completely unaware of how uniformly television of that era depicted Middle Eastern characters as threats. The Boston Marathon timing transformed it from a bad episode into something that carried a genuinely disturbing resonance, and the show and network have handled it by keeping it as quiet as possible. What these 3 episodes share, despite their very different circumstances, is that they each represent a moment where the relationship between Family Guy and the world it exists in became suddenly uncomfortably real. Partial terms of endearment touched a political nerve that American broadcasting has never been entirely willing to engage with. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein navigated the always treacherous space of humor about religion and ethnicity in ways that made a network nervous, even before anyone had a chance to watch it. And Turban Cowboy had the genuinely terrible misfortune of existing at a moment in history that made one of its jokes read as something other than a joke. None of these episodes represent the worst content the show has ever produced in terms of pure shock value or graphic content, but each of them arrived at a point where the ordinary calculations about what is acceptable comedy collided with something larger than the show itself. And in each case, the resolution was the same. The episode got buried, recontextualized, or stripped from easy access, leaving it to exist mostly in conversation rather than in actual viewing. There is a 4th category worth mentioning, which is the episodes that were not quite banned but were quietly modified in ways that created 2 distinct versions of the same piece of television. The episode Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q from Season 10, was heavily criticized for its depiction of domestic violence in what many viewers felt was an uncomfortably graphic and unfunny manner. It was not banned, but it became one of those episodes that the network and show have treated gently in terms of repeat airings and streaming placement. Similarly, Quagmire's Dad from Season 8, which featured a trans woman character in a storyline that drew substantial criticism for its handling of trans identity, has aired in repeats but occupies a complicated position in the show's relationship with its own legacy. The pattern across all of these cases is not arbitrary. It reflects the ongoing negotiation between creative ambition and broadcast reality that every long-running network show navigates. The difference with Family Guy is that this negotiation has, at various points, produced genuinely significant pieces of television history that most people have never had the chance to watch. And for every episode that got officially banned or censored, there are dozens of individual scenes and moments that went through the same process on a smaller scale, quietly edited out between the table read and the final broadcast without anyone outside the production ever knowing they existed. Section 3. The Censored Cuts Hidden in Plain Sight. There is a scene that Seth MacFarlane has described as his favorite episode ever made that most people have never seen in its original form. Road to Rhode Island is one of the most celebrated episodes in the show's history. It aired in May of 2000 during the 2nd season, and it was the episode that proved Brian and Stewie could carry a story together without the rest of the Griffin family. The cast and crew have consistently pointed to it as one of the best things the show produced. MacFarlane himself called it his favorite, and it exists in at least 2 different versions, one of which cannot be found on any currently available official release. The version you can watch today on Hulu or on DVD contains a sequence in which Stewie attempts to sneak his weapons through an airport security checkpoint by using song and distraction. In the original version of the episode, immediately after Stewie successfully gets his weapons through, there is an additional beat. Osama bin Laden is shown doing the exact same thing, using the same strategy to get his own weapons onto a plane. It is an absurdist gag built on the premise that airport security is so porous that even the world's most wanted terrorist and a diabolical toddler are using the same workaround. The episode originally aired in May of 2000. On the 11th of September 2001, the world changed in ways that made a joke about a terrorist successfully sneaking weapons onto a plane feel impossible to broadcast again. The scene was cut from the episode for all subsequent airings and was not included on the first DVD release of the season. It has appeared on some later extended cuts, and there is a version of it documented in fan communities. But for a long time, if you wanted to watch Road to Rhode Island in anything like the form its creators originally intended, you simply could not. MacFarlane was famously connected to the September 11 attacks in a different and deeply personal way. He was booked on American Airlines Flight 11, one of the two planes that struck the World Trade Center. He arrived late to the airport that morning and missed his flight. The show he created had already made a joke about a terrorist getting weapons onto a plane before any of that happened, and now both the personal event and the comedy had been transformed by history into something neither was meant to be. The decision to cut the bin Laden scene was straightforward, and nobody at the time seriously argued against it. But it created the situation where one of the most praised episodes in the show's history exists in an incomplete form for most of the people who have watched it. The cut is clean enough that casual viewers would never know anything was missing. But the original version tells a slightly different joke about the relationship between terrorism and the theater of airport security, and that version of the joke has been largely unavailable for over 2 decades. Beyond that episode, there is the broader phenomenon of scenes that were cut specifically because Fox's Standards and Practices Department flagged them during the production process. The episode PTV, which aired in November of 2005 during the 4th season, was built around this phenomenon entirely. The episode is a response to the Federal Communications Commission's crackdown on broadcast content following the Super Bowl 38 halftime show controversy, where Janet Jackson's wardrobe malfunction during a performance with Justin Timberlake triggered a massive wave of indignation and FCC action. Seth MacFarlane and the writers were furious about the FCC's response, which they saw as a disproportionate overreaction driven more by political calculation than genuine concern about broadcast standards. So they made an episode about it. Peter starts his own television network, PTV, and broadcasts classic shows in unedited form, along with original programming that includes a show called Midnight Q, hosted by Quagmire, and another called the Peter Griffin Sideboob Hour. What made PTV unusual was that it contained a montage of scenes that had been cut from previous episodes specifically because Fox's internal censors had flagged them. These were real cuts from real episodes, gathered together and deployed in a single episode, as both a creative choice and a statement about the censorship process the show was constantly navigating. The episode was, in that sense, a museum of deleted Family Guy content, fragments of the show's shadow archive, assembled and shown to audiences who had no idea that any of it had ever been produced. The scenes themselves, when you see them, are exactly what you would expect from a show whose creative team spent considerable energy trying to figure out how far they could push broadcast television. Some of them are crude. Some are violent in ways that go past cartoon slapstick. Some are funny. And some are surprisingly mild, flagged not because they were particularly shocking, but because they contained the wrong word or a gesture that someone in a standards review decided could be interpreted the wrong way. The PTV episode received a Primetime Emmy nomination for Outstanding Animated Program. It is one of the better regarded episodes of the revival era, and it works partly because the scenes it pulls from the cutting room floor are real evidence of a creative process that the audience was only seeing the sanitized end product of. Family Guy was not just a show that occasionally pushed against the FCC. It was a show that had a continuous, active, often contentious relationship with every layer of the broadcast system above it, from Fox's internal standards department all the way up to federal regulators. And that relationship generated deleted content at a rate that most shows never approach. Another category of hidden cuts involves scenes that were animated and then pulled because they worked against a storyline that the show decided to change during production. Animation is an expensive, labor-intensive medium. When a scene gets cut in a live-action show, you lose the cost of a day of filming. When a scene gets cut in animation, you lose the cost of animating it, which can represent weeks of work by multiple artists. The incentive to cut as little as possible is enormous, which means that when scenes do get cut from animated shows, it is usually because the case for cutting them was considered overwhelming. The Family Guy Wiki, maintained by the show's fan community, has documented deleted scenes from seasons 4 onward with considerable care. The deleted scenes pages for each season list scenes that were animated in color and then cut, as opposed to animatics, which are rougher preliminary versions that never made it to final animation. For some seasons, these lists are extensive. For others, they are relatively short. What is consistent across all of them is the variety of reasons for the cuts. Scenes that ran long, jokes that tested poorly in table reads, content that got flagged by standards, and moments that the writers decided did not serve the episode as a whole. One persistent category is scenes involving characters that the show has created and then quietly retired. Family Guy has introduced dozens of characters over its run, some of whom became beloved recurring figures, and others who appeared once or twice and then disappeared without explanation. The deleted scenes often contain more material featuring these peripheral characters, giving them more depth and backstory than the broadcast versions ever did. Because the scenes got cut, that depth was lost. The audience sees the simplified version of the character, if they see them at all. The fuller version lives only in the archive. There is also a class of deleted content that exists only because an animator decided to go off-script. The most famous example of this is a scene from Road to Rhode Island, involving a character named Amanda Rebecca, who appears briefly in the episode as a couples therapist Peter and Lois visit. In the broadcast version, the therapist session is played for quick laughs before cutting away. What an animator created as an extension of this scene, apparently as a private joke during production, was something considerably more explicit. The extended version of the therapy scene surfaced on the internet years after the episode aired, attributed to an animator who created it on their own time and without any intention of it ever being broadcast. It exists in a weird liminal space between official deleted content and something that was never part of the show at all in any meaningful sense. The Lost Media Wiki has documented it. It circulates in certain corners of the internet. It is emphatically not something that was intended for an audience. This gets at something important about the shadow archive of any long-running creative production. Not everything that exists but was not broadcast is deleted in the same sense. Some things were cut for practical reasons. Some were cut for creative reasons. Some were cut because a network or regulator said no. And some were created in the margins of the production process by people who had access to the tools and the characters and the time, and who made something that was never meant to exist as content at all. The archive contains all of it, undifferentiated, and the difference between these categories matters when you are trying to understand what the show was actually trying to do versus what ended up in the record as an artifact of the process. The question of what Family Guy was actually trying to do, especially in its early seasons, is one that gets more complicated the more closely you look at it. Because the show that exists is already a heavily edited version of something that was producing more than it ever aired, and the show that could have existed, if different decisions had been made at different points, was something genuinely different. Section 4. The biggest mystery: who can actually hear Stewie? Seth MacFarlane once said in an interview that the single most asked question about Family Guy was also the one he found hardest to answer cleanly. He was talking about Stewie Griffin, specifically about whether the people around Stewie can understand him when he speaks. This is one of those questions that sounds simple until you start actually trying to answer it, at which point it fractures into something philosophically interesting. Because Stewie speaks. He speaks constantly, at length, with complete sentences and complex vocabulary, and a refined British accent that the show has at various points suggested is itself a performance rather than his natural voice. He speaks to Brian, who responds. He speaks to strangers, some of whom respond and some of whom do not. He delivers monologues in rooms full of people who do not react to them at all. He expresses clearly murderous intentions toward his mother in front of his mother, who does not react. And the show has, across more than 25 seasons, never settled on a consistent, canonical answer to what is actually happening. MacFarlane addressed it directly in an interview with TV shows On DVD, saying that the question was the most frequently asked about the show. His answer was that everyone in the Family Guy universe can hear and understand Stewie fully, but that because he is a toddler, nobody takes what he says seriously. They simply discount him the way adults discount the utterances of a baby, even when those utterances include detailed plans for world domination and explicit statements of intent to murder Lois. At a San Diego Comic-Con panel in 2011, MacFarlane provided a slightly different answer. Brian, he said, always understands Stewie. Chris understands him occasionally. Peter, Lois, and Meg generally do not understand him. But then he immediately qualified this by saying that these were not firm rules, that the writers would break them whenever a specific gag worked better with a different arrangement, and that trying to impose too rigid a logic on Stewie's comprehension situation was essentially a creative trap. Executive producer Rich Appel, speaking to TV Line in 2015, offered a version that prioritized the show's internal logic over any attempt at realism. Within the family, Brian understands Stewie, and Chris sometimes does. But for the rest of the world, for Peter and Lois and Peter's friends and the random people Stewie encounters, it is important that they cannot understand him. Because the comedy depends on the gap between what Stewie is actually saying and what the people around him think they are hearing. The show has occasionally addressed this directly in the text of episodes. In Season 11's Big Fat, a dream sequence shows Hank Hill waking up from a dream in which he was Peter Griffin. And as he wakes, Hank says something along the lines of, "I always wake up before I find out if they can understand the baby." It is a self-aware joke about the unresolved nature of the question, the show acknowledging in its own way that there is no clean answer. Season 19's premiere, Stewie's First Word, took a different approach. The episode's premise is built around the question, with Stewie suddenly and inexplicably becoming comprehensible to everyone when he yells a swear word during a moment of intense emotion. Brian is baffled by this, asking Stewie why, after years of speaking in complex, articulate sentences, everyone has suddenly understood him this one time. Stewie's theory is that he was feeling such intense emotion in the moment that the word burst through in a way his normal speech does not. It is a characteristically unsatisfying answer, but it is the show's most recent canonical attempt to address the question, and it suggests that Stewie's comprehensibility is tied to emotional intensity rather than volume or clarity. The Family Guy Fan Wiki has compiled an extensive breakdown of every episode in which a character's response to Stewie either confirms or casts doubt on their ability to understand him. The analysis is genuinely interesting. Lois's responses to Stewie are documented as chronically ambiguous. She responds to his movements and his general affect in ways that suggest she is reading his physical cues rather than his words. She picks him up when he seems distressed. She feeds him when he signals hunger. But her actual verbal responses to his statements are almost always vague enough to be consistent with either hearing and ignoring him or simply not hearing the content of what he says at all. Brian is the clear exception. Brian has full, detailed conversations with Stewie. Brian responds specifically to the content of what Stewie says, asks clarifying questions, expresses disagreement with specific points Stewie makes. Brian's comprehension of Stewie is not ambiguous in any reading of the show. He hears Stewie and he understands him and he treats him accordingly. The fan theory community has used this distinction as the foundation for an extensive body of work trying to explain the mystery. One of the most compelling theories is that Stewie's comprehensibility is not a fixed property of the character, but a variable that shifts based on the narrative needs of a given scene. In other words, the show is not trying to establish a consistent internal rule because the creative team has decided that maintaining ambiguity serves them better than resolving it. The question of who can hear Stewie is not a mystery waiting to be solved. It is a deliberate choice to keep the mystery alive, because the mystery is more interesting than any answer would be. There is something almost philosophical in this. Stewie's voice is the show's most potent dramatic irony. The audience hears him. The audience understands everything he says. And the people around him largely do not respond to it, or respond in ways that suggest they are processing something different from what we are hearing. This gap between what we know and what the characters know is the fundamental engine of the Stewie jokes that work best. His plans for world domination are funny not just because a baby is making them, but because the baby is making them in front of his mother, and she is looking at him with the gentle, slightly distracted warmth of someone who sees a happy infant making contented sounds. Once you take that ambiguity away, once you establish clearly and permanently that either everyone can hear Stewie or nobody can, something is lost. The joke relies on the uncertainty. It relies on the possibility that Lois might be hearing him and simply choosing not to engage with the content of what he says, which is in its own way more disturbing than the alternative. And then there is the British accent itself, which opens another layer entirely. In a later season episode, Stewie admits to a school counselor that his British accent is not his actual voice. It is what he calls an affectation, a coat of armor he developed to feel different and special. His natural speaking voice, when revealed in the episode, is apparently ordinary enough that the counselor cannot tell the difference between it and the accent, which the episode plays as a joke. Stewie, horrified by the suggestion that he might just sound like everyone else, immediately returns to the accent. This revelation raises obvious questions about the timeline of the character. In the first season, Stewie is an infant who speaks with a refined British accent, builds advanced weaponry in his bedroom, and plots the death of his mother. Was the accent always a performance? Was the evil genius persona always a performance? Are both of these things, the accent and the villainy, elaborate constructions built by a child who understood from very early in his life that being ordinary was intolerable to him? The show never answers this. The episode where Stewie reveals the accent thing resolves with him going right back to the accent and then, crucially, letting the counselor who learned his secret die rather than getting him his heart medication, which is darkly funny and also does not illuminate anything further about what Stewie's internal experience of his own identity actually is. The question of who Stewie really is sits underneath the question of who can hear him, and neither question has a satisfying answer. They are both deliberate gaps in the show's self-knowledge, maintained because the maintenance of the gap is more interesting than its closure. The comprehension question also intersects with the show's broader relationship with its own internal continuity in ways that are revealing. Family Guy has never been a show that cared deeply about maintaining consistent canon. Characters remember things or forget them based on what serves the current episode. Relationships are established and then contradicted. The show exists in something like a permanent present tense where the past is available as reference material but is not binding on what happens next. The Stewie comprehension question is the most famous instance of this, but it is not the only one. The show's relationship with time and consequence is fundamentally inconsistent, and the most devoted fans of the early seasons would argue that this inconsistency became much more pronounced after the revival in 2005, when the writing staff changed and the people with the most institutional memory of how the show handled its own rules either left or stepped back. But even in the earliest seasons, the comprehension question was unresolved. It was unresolved in the pilot. It was baked into the show's DNA from the first day of production. And MacFarlane's various attempts to answer it publicly, from the everyone understands him but ignores him, answer to the Brian understands him but not the parents, answer to the we break the rules when a joke needs us to answer, all of these are gestures toward coherence rather than actual coherence. What this means, if you sit with it for a moment, is that one of the most fundamental questions about one of the show's most beloved characters has been deliberately left open for 26 years. Not because the answer is complicated, not because the show is building toward a reveal, but because the people who make the show have decided, correctly, that a question nobody can fully answer is more valuable than an answer nobody entirely needs. Section 5. The Dark Fan Theories That Change Everything. In August of 2012, a Reddit user with the handle bblank0308 posted a theory to the forum's fan theories section that gathered over 540 upvotes in the decade before it was eventually discovered by TikTok and went viral all over again. The theory is called colloquially the Peter is going insane theory, and it is, depending on your tolerance for this kind of thing, either one of the most compelling reframings of a long-running television show ever assembled by a viewer, or a darkly creative piece of imaginative writing that deliberately ignores the fact that it is just a cartoon. Here is the theory. In the reality that exists before the show begins, the Griffin family was different. Meg Griffin was a popular, conventionally attractive girl. Chris Griffin was mentally deficient, having suffered a lack of oxygen during birth. One night, Meg took her brother Chris to a party and drove home drunk afterward. The accident killed both of them. Lois Griffin, pregnant with a third child she would have named Stewie, took her own life out of grief. Peter Griffin, unable to process the loss of his entire family, went insane. And the events we see in Family Guy, all 26 seasons and counting, are a hallucination occurring inside Peter's fractured mind. Within this framework, the show's most persistent and confusing elements suddenly acquire explanations. Meg is abused and despised within the hallucination because Peter's unconscious mind blames her for the accident that killed his children and drove his wife to suicide. She is beautiful, in reality, But in Peter's mind, she has been disfigured by his resentment into someone he cannot stand to look at. Chris is present in the fantasy because Peter needed to construct a version of his son that could exist, but Chris's mental deficiency has been overwritten by Peter's imagination into a version of the boy that works, however imperfectly. Stewie, whom Peter never actually met, is constructed from pure wishful thinking, a child of enormous potential and intelligence who was robbed of his chance to live and so exists in Peter's mind as the baby who could have been everything. Stewie's desire to kill Lois reflects Peter's buried anger at her for dying. His world domination schemes are the unformed, grandiose potential of a child who never got to grow into anything at all. Brian is Peter's own suppressed intelligence, the version of himself that he believed he could have been if things had been different, rendered as a literary dog who drinks too much and cannot quite finish the novel he keeps starting. Peter's own intelligence regressed to the level of a lovable, dangerous idiot because he needed the guilt and grief and complexity of his actual life to go somewhere. He put the smart parts of himself into the dog and kept the dumb, impulsive, childlike parts for himself because the dumb parts are easier to live with than the smart parts when the smart parts know what actually happened. The theory went viral on TikTok in late 2022, with users encouraging each other to look it up and describing it as disturbing. Their reaction was not unreasonable. Once you have read the theory and looked at a few episodes through its lens, certain things are genuinely difficult to unsee. The way Peter's cruelty toward Meg carries a specific flavor of resentment rather than simple comedy. The way Brian's alcoholism and failed aspirations map onto a kind of self-knowledge that the show never quite lets him fully articulate. The way Stewie's obsession with his own mortality and his complicated feelings about his mother create a texture that is richer than you would expect from a character whose basic premise is evil baby. The theory has significant problems if you try to push it too hard. It cannot account for the show's complete inconsistency with its own rules about what Peter knows and does not know. It cannot account for the metafictional moments where characters acknowledge they are on a television show. It works well as an emotional framework for understanding the show's tonal shifts and character choices, but it does not hold up as a rigorous explanation for every plot point across 26 seasons. But that is not really the point of a theory like this. The point is that it reframes the show's most disturbing elements, specifically Meg's treatment, as something that has an internal emotional logic rather than being arbitrary cruelty for comedic effect. It suggests that everything uncomfortable about Family Guy is uncomfortable for a reason, even if that reason is a tragic backstory that the show would never actually confirm. There is another theory, quite different in character, that addresses the show's metaphysics rather than its psychology. This one starts with the Season 6 episode Road to the Multiverse, in which Brian and Stewie travel between parallel universes and encounter versions of the Griffin family in different states of reality. The episode's premise is that multiple versions of the Family Guy world exist simultaneously, each shaped by different historical and physical parameters. In one universe, Christianity never existed, and the world is technologically advanced. In another, the world looks like a Disney animation. In another, everyone is transformed by a dog zapping device. The theory built on this episode argues that the show's dramatic shift in tone and character between its original 3-season run and its revival in 2005 is not a continuity problem or a symptom of creative decay. It is, within the show's own established multiverse framework, a literal different universe. The Family Guy of Seasons 1 through 3 and the Family Guy of Seasons 4 onward are not the same show in any meaningful internal sense. They are parallel versions of the same premise, with different characters and different rules, connected only by shared names and physical appearances. This is a genuinely playful theory, because it uses the show's own creative choices, specifically the multiverse episode, to validate what most fans already feel intuitively, which is that the early seasons and the later seasons are essentially different shows. The theory even has a canonical reference point. In Back to the Pilot, a Season 10 episode where Brian and Stewie use Stewie's time machine to revisit the events of the first ever episode, the two characters from the current version of the show encounter the characters from the first season, and the differences between them are played partly for laughs. The theory reads this not as comedic self-reference, but as an in-universe acknowledgement that the two eras of the show are literally separate realities. Then there is the purgatory theory, which is perhaps the darkest of the major frameworks applied to the show. The basic version of this theory holds that the Griffin family is in some form of afterlife punishment, with each character trapped in a state of existence that represents a particularly pointed form of torment. Stewie, an adult intelligence trapped in a baby's body, unable to grow up or act on his own considerable capabilities in any sustained way. Brian, a genuine intellectual trapped as an animal, regarded by the world as a pet rather than a person. Lois, a wealthy and socially accomplished woman from a prominent family, trapped in a lower middle-class existence married to a man who makes her life harder on most days than it needs to be. Peter, a man-child perpetually cycling through the same childish impulses without any of the growth that would allow him to become something more. Meg, existing at the absolute bottom of every social hierarchy she inhabits, rejected by the people who are supposed to love her most. The purgatory theory argues that these are not random character configurations. They are precisely calibrated punishments for whatever each character did in a prior existence. The particular cruelty of each person's situation is designed to make them confront the specific inadequacy they refuse to confront in life. And the reason nothing ever permanently changes in the show, the reason every genuine emotional resolution gets walked back in the next episode, is that purgatory is not a place where resolution is the goal. It is a place where you confront the same things over and over, across eternity, until you are truly done with them. It is a bleak framework. But it maps onto the show's actual structure with uncomfortable accuracy. The Griffins have a remarkable number of episodes that build to a moment of genuine emotional resolution, some coming together moment where Peter acknowledges his failures, or Meg stands up for herself, or Brian confronts his own pretension honestly, and then the next episode begins as if none of it happened. The reset is not just a creative convenience. In the Purgatory reading, it is the whole point. What is interesting about all three of these major theories is that they address the same fundamental anxiety about the show, which is the question of why terrible things keep happening to these characters with no lasting consequence. The Peter is going insane theory says it is because none of it is real. The multiverse theory says it is because different rules apply in different versions of the show's reality. The purgatory theory says it is because consequence is not the point. Each theory is a different way of making peace with a show that, especially in its later seasons, seems structurally resistant to the kind of character growth that would make it feel more like a story and less like a loop. The fan theory community around Family Guy is not unique in this respect. Any long-running show with a passionate audience will develop elaborate interpretive frameworks for the moments the show cannot or will not explain. But what is specific to Family Guy is the way these theories tend to circle back to the same questions about identity and reality and consequence that are also embedded in the show's most interesting canonical mysteries. The Stewie comprehension question. Brian's nature as a dog who is not really a dog. Peter's oscillation between genuine warmth and genuine cruelty. These are not just plot holes or character inconsistencies. They are the show's most persistent gaps in self-explanation, and the fan theory community has been trying to fill them with increasingly elaborate structures for a very long time. Section 6. Brian Griffin's true origin. The dog who should not exist. Brian Griffin is, on paper, a talking dog. He walks upright, he drives a car, he drinks martinis and writes fiction, and has opinions about wine. He has been to college. He has had relationships with human women. He cares about politics and literature and his own legacy in ways that most of the human characters around him do not. He is, by any reasonable metric, not a dog in any functional sense beyond the biological. The show never fully explains how this happened. The closest it gets is in the Season 1 episode Brian, Portrait of a Dog, which establishes some details of Brian's background. He was born in Austin, Texas. His mother's name was Biscuit. His father's name is never given. His mother, in an event that haunts several later episodes, was stuffed and turned into an end table after her death, which Brian eventually encounters and which is played first for horror and then for a complicated kind of grief that the show handles with more sensitivity than you might expect. But none of this explains the fundamental strangeness of Brian's existence. Biscuit, his mother, appears in the flashback sequences of several episodes, and she is depicted as a dog in the ordinary sense. A dog that does not speak with a human voice, that does not walk upright, that does not hold opinions about Hemingway. The gap between Brian's nature and his mother's nature is enormous, and the show treats it as simply a given, something that happened and does not require explanation. This has generated one of the most elaborate fan theories in the show's history. The theory, posted to Reddit and subsequently picked up by Screen Rant and other sites, argues that Brian Griffin is a product of genetic experimentation by the CIA. The theory draws on crossover material between Family Guy and American Dad, which is also a Seth MacFarlane creation, and which involves the CIA quite heavily through its protagonist Stan Smith. In the Family Guy universe, the CIA is established as an entity with capabilities well beyond the ordinary, and the theory suggests that at some point, scientists working for the agency developed a technique for producing dogs with human-level intelligence and physical capabilities. The evidence the theory marshals is circumstantial but interesting. Brian understands the mechanics of Stewie's time machine in ways that suggest familiarity with physics at a level that a dog who simply happened to be smart would not naturally possess. He has detailed knowledge of literature and art and culture that goes beyond what could be explained by simply growing up in the Griffin household, which is not exactly a cultural incubator. His social skills, his ability to pass in human society, his navigation of the gap between what he is physically and what he is cognitively, all of these suggest that Brian is not a natural occurrence. The theory also addresses the show's other talking animals. Ernie the giant chicken, Peter's long-running nemesis, is an anthropomorphic chicken capable of sustained violence, complex motivation, and apparently a married domestic life. There are other animals in the Family Guy universe that appear to have human-level cognition in specific contexts. The theory suggests that these might represent different experiments in the same research program. Animals elevated to something like human consciousness through methods that are never specified but clearly existed. What makes this theory genuinely compelling, beyond its internal consistency, is what it does to the emotional weight of Brian's most poignant storylines. If Brian is a product of deliberate creation, rather than natural chance, then his existential anxiety, his sense of not quite belonging anywhere, his relationships that never quite work out, his novel that never quite gets finished, all of these acquire a different resonance. He is not a dog who became human by accident. He is a human soul in a dog's body, and whether that happened through science or magic or the show's general indifference to explanatory logic, the experience of being that thing is genuinely difficult. The episode Brian and Stewie from Season 8 is the moment where this difficulty surfaces most directly. The episode is a bottle episode, set entirely in a bank vault where Brian and Stewie are accidentally locked over a holiday weekend. There are no cutaway gags. There is no other plot. It is just two characters in a confined space having conversations that become progressively more honest as the episode continues. In the episode, Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box at that very bank. He tells Stewie that he keeps it there for a specific reason, because he is not sure he trusts himself not to use it on himself if it were easier to access. It is one of the most startling moments in the show's history. Family Guy, a show famous for cutaway gags and gross-out humor and the kind of comedy that rarely requires emotional investment, suddenly has its most intelligent character confessing suicidal ideation to a baby in a bank vault, and the show plays it straight. It does not cut away. It does not diffuse it with a quick joke. It sits with it. Stewie's response is to tell Brian how much he means to him. It is, in the context of everything else the show does, an extraordinary scene, and it works precisely because of the gap in Brian's nature that the show has never explained. A dog that talks is a joke. A consciousness that does not know how to exist in the body it was given is something considerably more complicated. The mystery of Brian's origin is also the mystery of his decline in the later seasons. The show's handling of Brian after roughly season 9 or 10 is, by most accounts, deeply unsatisfying. The dog who was the show's most sympathetic and intellectually interesting character became, in the hands of different writers with different priorities, someone who behaved in ways that seemed to contradict everything the character had established about himself. His hypocrisies became cruder. His relationships became shallower. His writing aspirations became a joke rather than a genuine vulnerability. The character who in Brian and Stewie had confessed to keeping a gun for specific and dark reasons became, in later seasons, someone who did genuinely cruel things and faced no consequences for them. If you believe the CIA theory, this decline has an explanation. The experiment that created Brian was not stable. The human consciousness grafted onto a canine biology is inherently under strain, and the cracks that appeared in Brian's character in the later seasons are not bad writing, but the inevitable expression of a nature that was always going to be internally conflicted. This is a generous reading that gives the show more credit than it probably deserves for what most people would describe as a writing staff that lost the thread of who Brian was supposed to be. But it is an interesting lens, and it connects to a broader question about the show, which is whether the character's deterioration in the later seasons represents creative failure or is in some sense legible as a natural progression of people, however unusual their origins, who have been living in extremely stressful circumstances for a very long time. Brian's death in Season 12's Life of Brian and his resurrection 2 episodes later in Christmas Guy is the most dramatic evidence that the show's relationship with its own characters is primarily transactional. Brian was killed. The audience reacted with genuine emotion. The death made national news. And then the show brought him back almost immediately, in a move that virtually everyone outside the production read as a rating stunt rather than a narrative choice. The theory that Brian's nature makes him harder to kill permanently, that something in whatever process created him has made him more durable than an ordinary dog, is not something the show endorses. But it is what some fans reach for when they try to make sense of a resurrection that the show itself seemed embarrassed by in retrospect. The origin remains unexplained. The nature remains ambiguous. Brian Griffin is the show's biggest metaphysical question after Stewie's comprehensibility, and the show has treated both questions with the same strategy. Acknowledge them occasionally, never answer them definitively, and rely on the audience's affection for the characters to outweigh the frustration of never knowing quite what they are. Section 7. Herbert, the Pervert, the character nobody was supposed to keep. John Herbert first appeared in the 3rd season episode To Love and Die in Dixie. He is an elderly man who moves to Spooner Street and immediately develops an interest in Chris Griffin that is unmistakable in its nature. He speaks in a soft, whispery voice. He moves slowly. He offers Chris things, baked goods, invitations to come look at something in his basement, opportunities to help him with tasks that require a young person's energy and the proximity that comes with it. The other characters around him respond to him with a kind of comfortable indifference, the way people respond to an old man who seems harmless because he moves slowly and speaks quietly and has a dog that is also old and slow and seems to be in considerable discomfort. The joke is that Herbert is not harmless at all. The entire comedic premise of the character is that a child predator can inhabit a neighborhood without detection because he performs the role of a sweet, slightly decrepit old man convincingly enough that nobody around him registers what he actually is. Chris, the target of Herbert's interest, is largely oblivious. The adults in the show are largely oblivious. And the audience, positioned to understand exactly what Herbert is saying and wanting in every scene, watches the gap between what is obvious and what the characters perceive. Herbert was voiced by Mike Henry, who has spoken in interviews about the character's origins. According to Henry, the idea for Herbert developed organically from a voice he would use in the writer's room when he wanted to critique other writers' ideas in a way that was funny rather than genuinely cutting. He would slip into a slow, whispery, creaking version of an old man's voice and use it to express mild disappointment or subdued approval. MacFarlane heard the voice and found it funny enough to put into the show. Henry was also reportedly inspired by an actual senior citizen he knew, someone whose demeanor and effect he found darkly amusing in a way he has not elaborated on publicly. The character was not created with a grand design. There was no plan for Herbert to become a recurring fixture of the show. The first appearance was a single scene. The voice was funny, the reaction in the room was good enough. And Herbert stayed, which says something interesting about how comedy characters develop in a writer's room, where sometimes the thing that survives is not the thing that was planned, but the thing that got a laugh at exactly the right moment from exactly the right people. Over time, the show developed Herbert's backstory in ways that complicated the character's function. A flashback sequence revealed that Herbert had served in the United States military during World War II. Another sequence revealed that he had been captured by the Nazis during the war and sent to a concentration camp, specifically because the Nazis had identified him as a pedophile. The detail is simultaneously an attempt to give Herbert depth and one of the most uncomfortable pieces of characterization the show has ever produced, acknowledging the character's crimes in the same breath as presenting him as a victim of one of history's most evil regimes. The show's treatment of Herbert has always existed in a space that comedy critics debate regularly. Some argue that Herbert is the show's most troubling character, because the humor around him functionally normalizes the idea of a child predator as a figure of gentle comedy rather than alarm. Others argue that the character's purpose is satire, that Herbert's invisibility to the adults around him is a pointed observation about how such people actually operate in real communities, hiding in plain sight behind the performance of harmlessness. Still others argue that these analytical frameworks are overthinking what is essentially a one-note joke that the show decided to run for 20-plus seasons. What is undeniable is that Herbert accumulated a mythology the show never fully settled. His relationship to Chris is one of the show's most enduring running threads, played exclusively for comedy and never resolved or addressed in any terms other than comic. The show has put Herbert in situations that push the limits of what the premise can bear, including a plotline involving him and a Nazi named Franz Schlecknacht that is one of the more elaborate pieces of storytelling the character ever received. Herbert rescues Chris from Franz. He is, within his own frame of reference, capable of something like heroism. The character contains more than the single note it started with. The voice actor Mike Henry left the role in 2020, along with other white voice actors who had been voicing non-white characters on animated shows during the broader industry conversation about representation in animation. The departure left Herbert in a complicated position. The character was not non-white, but Henry had created him and the voice was entirely his invention, and recasting an actor for a character so intimately tied to a specific vocal performance is always a complicated creative challenge. The character has continued to appear in the show with different voice actors, a situation that the devoted fan community has mixed feelings about. What is worth sitting with is the question of what Herbert was doing in the show in the first place. The character was not supposed to become a fixture. He was supposed to be a one-scene voice that was funny at a table read. The fact that he became one of the show's most recognized recurring figures, and one of its most controversial, is a function of the specific creative process that Family Guy uses, which gives considerable latitude to things that get laughs at the stage when scripts are being developed and tested. Herbert survived because he was funny to the people in the room. And the show, once it had him, expanded his backstory and integrated him into the recurring fabric of the Griffin family's neighborhood without ever fully reckoning with what it was doing. There are genuinely deleted storylines involving Herbert that never made it to air, scenes in which his backstory was developed further and his relationship with Chris was given more texture. These scenes exist on DVD extras for certain seasons. They tend to push the character in directions that are darker than what appears in the broadcast versions, not in terms of anything explicit, but in terms of how directly the scenes are willing to engage with the implications of the character's nature. The broadcast versions of Herbert are carefully calibrated to suggest rather than state. The deleted versions are sometimes more explicit in what they allow the character to say about himself and his situation. What is most interesting about Herbert, from the perspective of what the show chose not to show as much as what it chose to show, is that he is the character who most directly implicates the audience in the comedy. You laugh at Herbert because the show has constructed a situation in which his speech and his desires are audible to you in a way they are not audible to most of the characters around him. The comedy depends on your awareness of what Herbert is, which means that when you laugh, you are laughing at something that you would, in any real-world context, recognize as a serious concern and presumably act on. The show has maintained this gap for 26 years, and what is strange about it is that the gap has never stopped being funny to a large portion of the audience, which tells you something about the way comedy functions in a controlled context, about the way a laugh can exist in a separate compartment from the moral response that the same situation would produce outside of fiction. Herbert is, in the end, the show's most honest experiment in how far comedy can go when the premise is completely clear and the framing is completely consistent. The show never pretends he is harmless. The show never exonerates him. It simply constructs a comedic context around him and then relies on that context to hold the weight of what he represents. Whether it does so successfully, whether the comedy is worth the cost of normalizing the character as a figure of gentle amusement, is a question the show has declined to answer for over 2 decades. Section 8. The deleted storylines that almost were. Every season of Family Guy generates story pitches that never make it to production, character arcs that are planned and then abandoned, and episode ideas that die somewhere between the whiteboard and the script. Most of these never surface publicly because they exist only in the memories of the writers who proposed them and the notes from writers' room sessions that are not archived anywhere accessible. But enough has leaked, through interviews and DVD commentaries and occasional candid remarks from people who worked on the show, to construct a sense of the roads that were not taken. The most significant category of abandoned storylines involves Stewie. The original Stewie, the evil genius baby with a plan for world domination and a passionate desire to eliminate his mother from the equation, was a character whose potential the original writing staff understood but whose long-term sustainability they were uncertain about. The concern, which MacFarlane has expressed publicly, was that the evil baby premise was a joke that had a finite number of angles. You could only watch Stewie try to kill Lois and fail so many times before the repetition overwhelmed the novelty. But the solutions considered for this problem went in several directions, not all of which were the direction the show eventually chose. One approach that was seriously discussed, according to multiple accounts from people who were in the writer's room, was to actually let Stewie succeed. Not permanently, not in a way that would destroy the show's premise, but in the kind of sustained arc that would give the character consequences for his actions. The Stewie Kills Lois two-parter from Season 6 was a version of this approach, but it resolved by revealing the whole thing as a simulation, which was exactly the kind of non-consequence ending that the transcript we worked from identifies as one of the show's most damaging creative habits. The version of the story that was discussed, before the simulation twist was settled on, apparently involved Stewie actually achieving some measure of his goals, and having to then live with what that meant. In a world where Stewie has what he wanted, is he happy? Is the goal of world domination actually about power, or is it about something else? Some deeper need for control or recognition or connection that would not be satisfied by actual dominance? These are interesting questions that would have produced a much more psychologically rich version of the character than the one the show eventually delivered. The decision to walk back the two-parter with the simulation twist was driven by practical concerns about what the show could sustain, and by the already progressing shift toward a softer version of Stewie that the writers were more comfortable with. But it foreclosed a direction that could have been something genuinely unusual in animated television. A villain protagonist who has to reckon with the achievement of his own stated goals. Another major category of abandoned storyline involves the supporting cast of characters who appeared in the early seasons and then faded without resolution. Cleveland Brown, Peter's neighbor and friend, eventually received his own spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which ran on Fox from 2009 to 2013. But before that spin-off was developed, there were storylines planned for Cleveland within the Family Guy framework that were abandoned when the spin-off became a priority. Some of these involved more direct exploration of Cleveland's marriage, his relationship with his son, and his position within the group of friends at the Drunken Clam. The spin-off absorbed some of this material. Other parts of it simply never got made. Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-using police officer who is one of Peter's closest friends, had an elaborate backstory developed in the early seasons that the show pulled back from, as his role shifted from admirable neighbor to comic figure. The episode A Hero Sits Next Door from the first season establishes Joe as someone Peter initially envies for his competence and capability, someone the neighborhood respects. Over time, the show's approach to Joe became considerably less respectful, and the backstory about how he ended up in a wheelchair, which the show has told in at least 2 different incompatible versions across different episodes, never received the kind of definitive treatment that would have given the character genuine depth. There were storylines planned for Meg that were abandoned at various points, particularly in the period after the show recognized that Meg's abuse had become a defining feature rather than a comedic wrinkle. Episodes were pitched and, in at least some cases, partially developed that would have given Meg a sustained character arc, something that allowed her to change her situation or develop genuine competencies rather than simply endure. Some of these were eventually incorporated into later seasons, particularly from season 15 onward, when the writing staff included more women who pushed for different treatment of the show's main female teenager. But a body of work that could have rehabilitated Meg's place in the show's hierarchy years earlier was produced and then shelved. The category of deleted storylines that is perhaps most interesting from a narrative perspective involves Brian's novel. In the early seasons, Brian's status as a failed writer who has been working on a novel for years is played as a genuine character vulnerability rather than a punchline. The novel is called Faster Than the Speed of Love, and it has never been finished within the show's timeline despite appearing as a plot element across multiple seasons. The show has used the unfinished novel as shorthand for Brian's inability to complete meaningful work, for his tendency to be better at the aspiration toward achievement than the actual achievement. There were apparently discussions at various points about resolving the novel storyline, about letting Brian finish the book and face whatever reception it received. The episode Brian Writes a Bestseller from Season 9 takes a version of this premise and uses it to make Brian more unlikable rather than more sympathetic. Having him write a bad self-help book that becomes popular through no merit of its own, and then treating Stewie cruelly in response to his success. But the deeper and more personal story of Faster Than the Speed of Love, the novel that represents Brian's actual artistic ambition, has never been resolved. Some fans have argued that this is intentional, that Brian's inability to finish the novel is the point, rather than a story element waiting for resolution. The novel is the thing Brian cannot do. The gap between his self-image and his actual productivity, and closing that gap would require the show to decide whether Brian is ultimately the character he thinks he is or the character his behavior suggests he has become. The show has consistently avoided making that decision. It is easier creatively to let the novel remain unfinished, a symbol of unrealized potential that the show can gesture toward without having to deliver. There are also the crossover storylines that were planned and then fell apart for reasons that usually had to do with the practical difficulties of getting competing networks and production companies to agree on terms. The Simpsons Guy crossover from Season 13 actually happened, which makes it the exception. For every crossover that made it to air, there were others that did not. A Futurama crossover was discussed during a period when both shows were on Fox. A more extensive American Dad crossover was discussed at various points. These conversations happened at the level of network executives and production companies, and eventually went nowhere for reasons that were almost certainly financial and contractual, rather than creative. The PTV episode that was discussed earlier represents a different kind of deleted storyline aggregate, a single episode that explicitly contains pieces of other episodes that never made it to air. The scenes used in PTV were real cuts from real episodes, which means that PTV is, among other things, an archaeological document. It preserves in broadcast form content that would otherwise have disappeared entirely. The joke about deleted content became the container for actual deleted content, which is a piece of creative self-awareness that deserves more recognition than it usually gets. Section 9. The Multiverse Problem: Which Family Guy is Real? The Season 8 episode Road to the Multiverse is ostensibly a comedy adventure in which Brian and Stewie travel between parallel universes using a remote control device. They visit a universe where Christianity never developed, and human civilization is centuries ahead of where it is in the main timeline. They visit a universe that resembles a Disney animated film. They visit a universe where Stewie used a device that transforms everyone who encounters it into a dog. The episode works as a comedy, and it is one of the better-regarded episodes of the revival era, a Brian and Stewie adventure with enough inventive scenarios to keep the humor fresh. But the episode does something else, something that the fan community has spent considerable time unpacking. It establishes, canonically and without qualification, that the Family Guy universe contains a genuine multiverse. Different versions of reality exist simultaneously. The characters you watch in any given episode are one version of themselves among an essentially infinite set of possible versions, which means that any inconsistency in the show's portrayal of its characters, any moment where someone behaves in a way that seems to contradict their established personality, any episode where the rules of the world seem to work differently than they did before, all of these could be explained by the show simply having shifted to a different universe. This sounds like a convenient excuse for sloppy writing, and it probably is, at least in part. But it also raises a genuinely interesting question about what continuity means in a show that has explicitly established that its fictional universe contains multiples of itself. The Family Guy that you watched in Season 3 is, in some philosophical sense, a different Family Guy than the one you watched in Season 15. The characters have the same names and the same faces and the same voice actors, but they make different choices, hold different values, and relate to each other in fundamentally different ways. Within the show's own multiverse framework, the most honest explanation for this is that you have been watching different universes all along. The episode Back to the Pilot from Season 10 pushes this even further. Brian and Stewie use the time machine to go back to the first episode of the show, the pilot from 1999. When they arrive, they encounter the versions of themselves from that episode. The current Brian talks to the Season 1 Brian. The current Stewie interacts with the Season 1 Stewie. And the differences are played for laughs, but they are real differences. The Season 1 characters are not simply earlier versions of the current characters. They are different people who share a superficial resemblance. The Season 1 Brian does not know things the current Brian knows. The Season 1 Stewie does not behave the way the current Stewie behaves. The show acknowledges these differences and then uses them as comedy. What the episode also does, by taking the characters back to the pilot and having them interact with it, is implicitly acknowledge that the show has changed in ways that the writers are aware of, and that they experience partly with nostalgia and partly with discomfort. The meta-awareness of Back to the Pilot is a kind of creative confession. We know we are different from what we were, we know you can see the difference, and we are choosing to make a joke about it rather than pretend it did not happen. The multiverse framework also intersects with the fan theory community in ways that are interesting. Several of the major fan theories about the show, including the purgatory theory and the Peter is going insane theory, can be reframed within a multiverse context as theories about which specific universe is being depicted. The universe of the show might be one in which the Griffin family died or in which Peter lost his mind. Not because the main Family Guy universe has that backstory, but because among the infinite parallel universes that Road to the Multiverse establishes must exist, there are presumably versions where those backstories are true. This recursive quality, where the show's canonical multiverse enables the fan theories about the show, is one of those places where fiction gets pleasurably complicated. The show created a rule that it intended to use for a fun adventure episode. The fan community used that rule to open up the entire show as a space for imaginative reinterpretation. And the show, by being generally uninterested in resolving its own continuity questions, has never officially closed off any of these interpretations. There is also the question of which version of the Griffin family is being observed in any given episode, which is something the show raises and then declines to answer. Different episodes portray the characters with different levels of warmth or cruelty toward each other. Different episodes give different backstory details for the same characters. Different episodes present the same character as capable of emotional growth or as constitutionally incapable of it, depending on what the current episode needs. Within the multiverse framework, the most coherent explanation is that these are different versions of the same characters encountered in different episodes of a show that never bothered to specify which universe it was depicting from one week to the next. This is not a satisfying answer to the continuity problems the show has accumulated over 26 seasons, but it is an interesting one. It suggests that the audience of Family Guy has, without necessarily realizing it, been watching something more like an anthology of related but distinct stories than a single continuous narrative about a specific family. The Griffins are a concept rather than a specific cast of people, and within that concept, the show has always maintained the freedom to portray them in whatever configurations serve the current episode's needs, with no obligation to reconcile those portrayals across time. The multiverse problem is, ultimately, the show's relationship with its own fictional reality stated in terms that the show itself provided. Family Guy told us its universe contains multiples of itself, and then it proceeded to act like a show that exists in multiple versions of itself. Whether that was intentional or simply a happy coincidence is something that nobody involved in making the show has ever commented on definitively. Section 10. The Lost Media. What we will never see. The Lost Media Wiki entry for Family Guy is quietly one of the more melancholy documents in that entire archive. Not because it catalogs things of enormous cultural significance. Family Guy is not Shakespeare, but because it catalogs, with careful documentation and appropriate uncertainty about what can be confirmed, the shape of a gap in the record of something that millions of people care deeply about. The confirmed unavailable material from seasons 1 through 3 is the core of it. The full-color deleted scenes from the show's original run, the ones that would have been formatted for DVD extras the way seasons 4 onward handled them, do not appear to exist in any public form. The Lost Media Wiki notes that only 3 deleted scenes from the first season have been verified to exist anywhere, glimpsed in old promotional footage, and a behind-the-scenes segment. The reasonable inference is that substantially more material from those seasons was produced, given the production realities of an animated show, and that most of it is either stored on private archives that have never been made public, or has been lost entirely in the transitions between different storage formats over the past 25 years. This matters because the first 3 seasons are, by almost any critical measure, the version of the show that worked best. They are the version that people remember when they talk about why they loved Family Guy. They are the version that produced the cultural impact that kept the show alive through 2 cancellations and sustained the DVD sales that brought it back from the dead. And the material from those seasons, Not just what aired, but the fuller body of work that was produced and not broadcast is largely inaccessible. The archiving situation for early digital television is a broader problem than just Family Guy. The late 1990s and early 2000s were a transitional period for digital storage, and a lot of material from that era has either been lost to format obsolescence, discarded during studio moves and consolidations, or simply never properly cataloged in the first place. Fox in particular has a complicated history with archiving animated content. Some material from early Simpsons seasons has also been difficult to locate in complete form. The bureaucratic and economic realities of maintaining archives for material that was not expected to have long-term commercial value created systematic gaps in the record that are very hard to fill retroactively. There is a different category of lost media that is more recent and more deliberate. The content that Fox and the production company have pulled from streaming platforms or declined to include in digital releases for contemporary reasons. The Turban Cowboy situation, where an episode was removed from streaming services after the Boston Marathon bombing and has never fully returned, is the clearest example. The episode exists on DVD. It exists in the production archive, but its streaming availability has been managed in ways that make it considerably less accessible than most of the show's catalog. The partial terms of endearment situation is different in kind. The episode is not unavailable because it was pulled from a platform it was once on. It is unavailable because it was never placed on the major platforms to begin with. It is not on Hulu. It was not included in the Disney Plus offering. It is on a DVD that you can find if you look for it. But the vast majority of people who discover and watch Family Guy through streaming have no access to it and no particular way of knowing it exists. What is philosophically interesting about this category of lost media is that it represents content that exists but has been made functionally unavailable through institutional decision rather than actual loss. The episode is not gone. It can be found. But the gatekeeping of the platforms that most people use means that for most people it might as well not exist. This is a different kind of disappearance from the physical loss of archival material, but the practical effect on a viewer is similar. The early deleted scenes situation is the reverse. The material may not have disappeared through any particular institutional decision. It may simply not have been maintained with the care that would have made it available. Nobody chose to lose the deleted scenes from the first 3 seasons, in all probability. They were simply not prioritized for preservation, in the way that later seasons were once the DVD market created a commercial reason to package and release them. There are also categories of lost media that exist in more informal spaces. The forums of Family Guy fan communities contain reports of scenes that people watched and then could not find again, moments that appeared in certain broadcast airings of episodes and were then edited out for syndication or streaming, gags that exist in some versions and not in others, with no clear record of which version is the original and which is the edit. Some of these reports are verifiable. Others are likely the product of imperfect memory combined with the genuine knowledge that the show has multiple versions of many episodes. The difference between a real alternate version and a misremembered viewing experience is not always possible to establish from the outside. The community around the show has, over many years, done impressive work in trying to document what exists and what does not. The Fan Wiki, the Lost Media Wiki, the various forums where people share DVD rips and document differences between broadcast and home release versions, all of these represent a genuine archival effort undertaken by people with no institutional support and considerable affection for the subject matter. They have found things that might otherwise have been permanently inaccessible. They have also, inevitably, created false leads and misattributed content. The archive they have built is imperfect, but it is the most complete public record that exists. What all of this lost and inaccessible material points toward is a version of Family Guy that is larger and stranger than the one that most people have watched. The show you can see on Hulu right now is a heavily curated selection of what was made, filtered through 2.5 decades of production decisions, network interventions, censorship battles, and archival accidents. The show that was actually created, including everything that was produced and not broadcast, everything that was broadcast and then pulled, everything that was pitched and developed and abandoned, and everything that simply could not be maintained in a form that made it accessible, is considerably more expansive than what is publicly available. Section 11. The unanswered questions that still haunt the show. There is a specific kind of mystery that develops in long-running fiction when the people making it either decide deliberately to leave questions open or simply move on without answering them, and the questions remain. Family Guy, across 26 seasons and more than 400 episodes, has accumulated a substantial body of both kinds. Some of these questions were left open deliberately as creative choices. The Stewie comprehension question is the clearest example. The writers understood that the question was unanswerable in satisfying terms and chose to maintain the ambiguity rather than resolve it into something smaller. This was the right decision. The mystery is more interesting than any answer would be, but other questions were left open by accident, by the cumulative effect of 26 seasons of inconsistent canon management, by the natural drift of a show that changed writing staffs and creative priorities multiple times over its run. These are the questions that haunt in a different way, not because they were meant to haunt, but because they are the accidental residue of a production that generated more than it could fully account for. The question of what Lois's family history actually is falls into this category. Early episodes establish that Lois comes from an extremely wealthy family, the Pewterschmidts, who view Peter with obvious contempt and whose money represents a social world that the Griffin family exists entirely outside of. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is a recurring character, arrogant and occasionally monstrous, and clearly a source of some of the most genuine pain in Lois's life. Her past includes relationships and experiences that are referenced inconsistently across different episodes. She was apparently a cheerleader. She had a relationship with Gene Simmons of Kiss. She was apparently involved in a commune at some point. These details exist in different episodes as one-off jokes or character flavor, and they do not cohere into a consistent biography. What the show never does is settle on a version of Lois's history that explains how she ended up where she is, married to Peter, in a house in a suburban neighborhood, rather than in the world her family inhabits. The gap between Carter Pewterschmidt's evident wealth and the Griffin family's evident financial precarity is never satisfactorily explained. The show gestures at it occasionally, suggests that Carter cut Lois off financially when she married Peter against his wishes, but the details shift and the depth of the estrangement changes depending on what a given episode needs. This is frustrating not because audiences need a complete biography of Lois Griffin, but because the gap in her history is one of the most interesting things about her character, and the show consistently declines to do anything sustained with it. The question of why a person from her background is living the life she leads is genuinely interesting, and the show's answer, more or less, is that it does not matter, and also she was probably always more naturally suited to this life than her upbringing would suggest, which is a non-answer dressed up as characterization. The question of what Quagmire actually is beneath the surface of his comedy persona is another of these lingering mysteries. Quagmire is presented primarily as a sexual predator played for laughs, someone whose behavior toward women is consistently presented as wildly inappropriate and occasionally illegal, without the show ever reckoning with what that means in sustained terms. But the show has also, in scattered moments across its run, given Quagmire depth that it then declined to develop. The episode where Quagmire's father is revealed to be a transgender woman, and Quagmire's reaction to this information is used to explore his emotional complexity in ways the show rarely allows itself, is the most famous example. The episode is controversial for its handling of trans identity, but what is interesting from a character perspective is that it shows a version of Quagmire who has a genuine inner life, genuine vulnerabilities, and a capacity for emotional processing that does not fit the one-note sexual predator archetype. The show sees this and then puts it away. The next episode, Quagmire is back to the surface version of himself, and the depth glimpsed in the previous episode is not referenced. The question of what Family Guy was originally going to be, before the cancellations and the restaffing and the revival, is perhaps the most unanswerable of all. MacFarlane's original vision for the show, articulated most clearly in the first 3 seasons and in the short animated films that preceded it, was something specific and coherent. A dysfunctional but genuinely loving family. An intelligent dog serving as the voice of reason. An evil baby as the show's most original creation. Sharp writing that treated the audience as intelligent people capable of following references and appreciating the timing of a well-constructed joke. The show that exists now is, in some ways, continuous with that vision, and in other ways almost entirely discontinuous with it. The unanswered question at the heart of the show is whether the version of it that people fell in love with, The version that drove the DVD sales and the Adult Swim ratings that brought it back from cancellation could have been sustained indefinitely if different decisions had been made. Whether the warmth and the character coherence and the balance between comedy and genuine emotional investment could have been preserved through the pressures of continued production, writer turnover, network interference, and the natural creative entropy that affects any long-running creative production. The answer that American Dad offers is that yes, it is possible to maintain the integrity of a Seth MacFarlane animated show for a very long time. American Dad, which debuted the same year Family Guy returned from cancellation, has been running for roughly the same duration and has not experienced the same dramatic decline in character coherence and creative ambition. The difference is not simply that one show had MacFarlane more involved than the other, though that is a factor. The difference is in specific creative decisions made by different teams of writers over many years, decisions about how to develop characters, how to use the comedy format, how to balance shock and sentiment, and how to manage the relationship between what audiences find entertaining in the short term and what sustains a show's identity over decades. The questions that haunt Family Guy are questions about creative stewardship, about what happens when the person who understood something best steps away from it, about whether a show can maintain its identity when the people running it are doing their best to approximate a vision they did not originate, about whether the audience's affection for what something was can sustain a show through a long period of being something else, and whether the something else it becomes is worth the affection being sustained. These are not questions with clean answers. They are questions that the show will continue to generate as long as it continues to be made, which according to the deal announced in April 2025, will be at least through the 2028 to 2029 television season. Each new season will add more content to the archive of things the show has made, and some of that content will be deleted, and some of it will be changed, and some of it will be cut between the table read and the broadcast. The shadow archive will keep growing. The questions will keep accumulating. The fans will keep trying to find the material that was pulled and theorize about the material that was never made and argue about the version of the show they saw in those first 3 seasons, and whether the show that exists now has anything left of what that was. And somewhere in the machinery of all of it, in the hard drives and the locked editing bays and the writer's room sessions that nobody outside the show will ever see, there is a version of Family Guy that is larger than any version any audience has ever watched. The complete version, the one with all the deleted scenes reattached, and all the banned episodes restored, and all the abandoned storylines given their full run, and all the questions answered with whatever answers the creators actually had before they decided to leave them open. That version does not exist in any form you can watch, but it is the show that all of this, all the theories and the lost media documentation and the fan community analysis and the decades of watching and rewatching and arguing about what it all means, it is the show that all of this is circling around. A show that can exist in your imagination precisely because it cannot be seen. There is something appropriate about that. Family Guy, a show built on the premise that the most interesting things happen in the space between what is said and what is heard, between what is shown and what is understood, between the character as they appear and the character as they actually are, has produced a shadow archive that operates on exactly the same principle. The version you have not seen is always the most interesting one, and the questions it raises are always the ones that do not have answers. Final thoughts. 26 seasons, more than 400 episodes, 3 cancellations if you count the period of serious doubt during the writer's strike, 2 complete revivals from cancellation, 1 episode that has never legally aired in the country that made it, hundreds of deleted scenes scattered across studio hard drives and fan archives, and the imperfect memories of the people who were in the rooms where they were made. An evil genius baby who may or may not speak a language that anyone around him can hear. A dog whose origins are never explained and whose nature is never settled. A family that loves each other and then does not, and then does again, in different proportions each time, across different realities that may or may not be the same reality from one week to the next. It is a lot to contain in a single show, and the fact that so much of it remains genuinely unresolved, genuinely mysterious, genuinely subject to argument and interpretation after all this time, is maybe the most interesting thing about it. The show that seemed like a simple cartoon about a stupid man and his weird family turned out to be something considerably stranger and more durable than that. It accumulated mysteries. It accumulated deleted content. It accumulated theories and controversies and banned episodes and censored scenes and fan interpretations that reframe every season of the show in a different light. The version of Family Guy that exists in the collective imagination of the people who have loved it is richer and more complicated than any version that has ever been broadcast. And that gap between the show as it can be watched and the show as it is imagined is the space where all of this lives. If you are still awake, or if you drifted off somewhere in the middle of all of this and you are finding your way back now, that is exactly as it should be. Some stories are better when you hear them slowly, in the dark, without the pressure of having to hold all of it at once. Sleep well. If you found your way through this whole thing, please leave a like. It genuinely helps, and the people who actually make it to the end of these long ones are the reason we keep making them. And subscribe, because we are just getting started with the kind of deep dives this channel is built for. End of script. Section 12. The Writer's Room. What gets killed before it breathes? There is a version of television production that the audience never sees, and it happens in a room before anything else happens. The Writer's Room. In the case of Family Guy, that room has been many rooms over 26 years, staffed by different people with different senses of humor and different thresholds for what is too much and different ideas about what the show should be trying to accomplish on any given Tuesday. Seth MacFarlane described the writer's room dynamic in a Fox News interview from 2018 by saying that within those walls, nothing could be off-limits, because absolute creative freedom is the prerequisite for any kind of genuine comedy. You cannot find the edge of what is funny without being willing to go past it. The table read serves as the corrective mechanism, the moment when the room discovers what actually works when spoken aloud rather than what seemed to work on paper. And then the network standards department serves as the final filter before anything reaches an audience. What this means in practice is that Family Guy generates an extraordinary volume of material that never survives any of these stages. The jokes pitched in the room that do not make anyone laugh are dead on arrival and never make it to script. The bits that made it into scripts but failed at table reads get cut. The scenes that passed the table read but got flagged by standards get modified or removed. And then there are the scenes that survived all of these stages and still got cut in the final editing process because the episode ran long, or the pacing was wrong, or someone somewhere decided that the episode worked better without them. The writers who have spoken publicly about the Family Guy room describe it with a combination of nostalgia and ambivalence. The early room, the one MacFarlane assembled for the show's original run, included writers like Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. These are people who came from different comedy backgrounds and who shared a sensibility that was, in the show's best moments, distinctive enough to feel like a genuine artistic voice rather than a collection of jokes assembled by a process. The challenge of sustaining that kind of room coherence over 26 seasons and through multiple periods of cancellation and revival is essentially impossible. Writers leave. New writers come in. Each new cohort brings different references, different comedic instincts, different comfort levels with different kinds of material. MacFarlane himself acknowledged that the constant cancellation and revival meant they were perpetually having to rebuild the room from scratch, which meant they were perpetually losing the accumulated institutional knowledge of who the characters were supposed to be and how they were supposed to work. What gets killed in the writer's room is not always the worst material. Sometimes the best material gets killed there, because the best material is often the most dangerous material, the thing that makes the room uncomfortable in productive ways, the joke that is so precise and so sharp that nobody is quite sure if it is acceptable or not. The culture of any given room will determine whether that kind of material gets developed or discarded. A room that is more comfortable with uncertainty will push further. A room that is more concerned with the risk of getting it wrong will pull back. The history of Family Guy's deleted content is partly a history of which rooms pushed further and which rooms pulled back. The evidence suggests that the original room pushed further consistently, and that the rooms that followed were variably more cautious. The early seasons have a quality of fearlessness that the later seasons have at best intermittently, and that fearlessness shows up not just in the content that aired, but in the content that was produced and then either cut or not produced at all because the room knew the network would not pass it. There are storylines that have been described in interviews that never made it to script stage because the room discussed them and concluded they were not viable either creatively or from a broadcast standards perspective. One category involves storylines that would have given major supporting characters genuine character arcs rather than the episodic treatment they usually receive. The character of Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, is an example the room apparently discussed at various points. Bonnie spent several early seasons pregnant, a pregnancy that went on far too long to be realistic, and was eventually resolved when she gave birth to Susie. During those seasons, there were apparently discussions about storylines that would have given Bonnie more to do and more interiority than the show ultimately provided. The decision not to pursue those storylines was partly a function of time and resources, partly a function of the room's priorities at any given moment, and partly a function of the show's structure, which has always been more focused on Peter and his immediate orbit than on the characters around him. Bonnie, Cleveland's wife Loretta, and various other characters in the extended Griffin family social world were created with enough detail to be interesting, and then not developed with enough consistency to become fully realized. This is the kind of lost potential that does not show up in any archive because it never made it to production. The deleted scenes and banned episodes represent things that were made and then removed from circulation. But the things that were discussed and decided against before they were ever made are an entirely different category of absence. They are the show that could have existed if different priorities had been in place in different rooms at different moments in the show's history. The most tantalizing category of this is the character-driven comedy that the early room was apparently capable of producing, but that the later rooms were less consistent at. The original Stewie and Brian dynamic, the early Peter and Lois relationship, the version of Joe Swanson who was genuinely admirable before the show decided it was funnier to make fun of him. These were the products of a room that was thinking about character coherence alongside the comedy. And the many discussions that happened in that room about those characters, about where to take them and what to explore and what to avoid, represent a creative process that the audience never had direct access to and that the archive can only gesture toward. Section 13. The chicken fight mystery and other recurring bits explained. There is a running storyline in Family Guy that has spanned the entire history of the show, received more collective screen time than some recurring supporting characters, and has never been fully explained. It involves Peter Griffin and a giant chicken named Ernie. The chicken fights are exactly what they sound like. Peter and Ernie encounter each other, usually after some slight that Peter perceives as disrespectful, and then they fight. They fight elaborately, at length, with real physical consequences that would be fatal in any realistic context. They fight through buildings and across city blocks, and through vehicles and over open water. The fights are animated with considerable care and go on for significantly longer than any single joke premise would normally be allowed to run. And then they end, and the next episode begins, and Peter and Ernie exist in whatever state of injury or recovery the previous fight left them in, until the next time they encounter each other and the whole thing starts again. The story of how this began is actually told in the show, in a way that the show later expanded and complicated. The original conflict between Peter and Ernie started over a coupon. Ernie gave Peter a coupon that Peter believed was still valid but which had expired, and Peter's response to this perceived slight escalated into the first of the epic battles that would recur throughout the show's run. The absurdist premise that one of the show's most elaborate recurring bits is rooted in a dispute over an expired coupon is exactly the kind of detail that early Family Guy was very good at. But the chicken fights accumulated canon as the show went on. Ernie was not simply a random giant chicken. He had a wife. He had a life outside of his encounters with Peter. The fights began to include genuine narrative beats, moments where one of them seemed to have defeated the other, moments of apparent truce, moments where the personal history between them was gestured toward in ways that suggested a relationship more complex than random antagonism. The show never fully cashed in on this complexity. It never produced a definitive episode that resolved the conflict or explained it fully. But the accumulated weight of dozens of fights across dozens of episodes created something that functions like a mythology even though the show has never treated it as one. There are deleted scenes involving Ernie, some of which have appeared on DVD extras, that give him more screen time and more characterization than the broadcast versions. In some of these scenes, Ernie speaks more than the show typically allows him to. In others, his domestic life, his relationship with his wife, his existence as a creature who is clearly capable of holding a job and maintaining a household and operating within society, is given more attention. These scenes push against the basic premise of the chicken fights, which is that the conflict between Peter and Ernie exists outside the normal social framework of the show. Giving Ernie too much personhood makes the fights feel different. The comedy depends on a certain kind of abstraction, on the fights being pure spectacle, rather than a conflict between two people with actual lives. The question of what Ernie actually is within the show's universe is connected to the broader question of Brian's nature and the general question of what it means for an animal to function as a person in the Family Guy world. The show is populated with animals who have human capabilities and limitations, Brian being the most prominent but far from the only example. Ernie can drive. Ernie can presumably read, given that he is capable of creating coupons with expiration dates. Ernie has a social network and a domestic life. The show never explains how any of this is possible in a universe where most animals are not like this, where the Griffin's other pets over the seasons have been ordinary animals without exceptional capabilities. The lack of explanation is intentional, or at least the lack of explanation has been sustained long enough that it functions as intentional. The show is not interested in the internal logic of its own world's relationship to animals with human cognition. It is interested in the comedy that these characters produce, and the internal logic questions are treated as irrelevant to that purpose, which is a reasonable creative position, but one that does accumulate unanswered questions over 26 seasons. The chicken fights themselves represent one of the show's most durable creative choices, something that has been effective enough to keep working decade after decade without any significant modification to the basic formula. The fights are well animated. The escalation is consistent. The humor comes from the commitment to the bit rather than from any particular narrative development within any individual fight. They are the show's clearest example of a premise that is so simple and so well executed that it does not require development to keep working. But the deleted scenes that give Ernie more context, that gesture toward a richer version of his existence, raise a question about whether the chicken fights could have been something more if the show had chosen to develop them. A genuinely realized rivalry between Peter and Ernie, one that had real history and real stakes within the logic of the show's world, would have been a different kind of comedy than the pure spectacle the show has chosen. It would have been harder to sustain, probably, because genuine character development in a long-running comedy is harder than recurring physical comedy. But the deleted scenes suggest that the material existed to attempt it, at least in fragments. Section 14. Stewie's Evolution and the Road Not Taken. The original Stewie Griffin was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most original character concepts in the history of animated television. A 1-year-old baby who spoke like a Shakespearean villain, built weapons in his crib, and devoted his considerable intellectual resources primarily to the project of ending his mother's life. The comedy was architectural. It was built on a gap so wide and so specific that it did not require anything else to be funny. The gap between what Stewie looked like and what Stewie was. The show eventually moved away from this. McFarlane and the writers have been candid about why they felt the evil genius baby premise had been taken as far as it could go, and that continuing to revisit the same jokes about world domination and matricide would make the character feel stale. So they softened him. They developed his friendship with Brian. They explored his emotional life. They introduced and then leaned heavily into aspects of his personality that had been present in early seasons as minor flavoring, but that became, in later seasons, the primary definition of the character. What is worth sitting with is whether the evil genius premise had actually been exhausted, or whether the writers had simply exhausted the particular approaches they had been using. Because the claim that a character concept has been taken as far as it can go presupposes that all the directions it could go have been explored, and the history of long-running character comedy suggests that this is rarely actually true. Stewie's evil genius was, at its core, a premise about the gap between appearance and reality, about the coexistence of harmlessness and danger in a single small body. This gap could have been developed in countless directions beyond the specific beats the show had established. What happens when Stewie's plans begin to actually succeed in sustained ways, not as a simulation or a dream, but in the actual world of the show? What happens when Stewie encounters an external threat that his capabilities are genuinely insufficient to address? What is the relationship between his genius-level intelligence and his emotional development, given that he is simultaneously a toddler and a supervillain, and those two things represent fundamentally different developmental stages that should not coexist but do? The road to episodes, which became the alternative direction the show chose for Stewie and Brian, are good. Some of them are among the best episodes the show has produced in its revival era, but they are a different kind of good than what the evil genius Stewie offered. They are warm where he was cold. They are adventure where he was threat. They are about friendship and the pleasures of two mismatched people, discovering that they like each other more than either of them would admit. These are valid and good things to explore in a comedy. But they are not the same thing as watching a baby in a diaper explain, with complete seriousness, his detailed plan for the subjugation of the planet's population. There were storylines planned for Stewie in the evil genius mode that were abandoned when the decision to soften the character was made. Some of these have been described in DVD commentary tracks and occasional interviews. They involve Stewie encountering other child geniuses and navigating the complicated social dynamics that would arise from being simultaneously the smartest person in any room and the person with the least social power due to his age and size. They involve Stewie's attempts to recruit allies among the world's existing power structures, to use the levers of adult society for his own ends, without revealing that he was a baby doing it. They involved, in at least one discussed premise, Stewie somehow gaining access to the international community and needing to maintain a diplomatic cover story while pursuing his actual agenda. None of these made it to production in any sustained form. Some elements of them appear in fragments across different episodes, moments where the show briefly resurrects the evil genius version of Stewie before retreating back to the softer version. But the direction as a whole was abandoned, and what replaced it, while often genuinely enjoyable, was something that the show acknowledged could not quite fill the specific void the original Stewie left. The Season 6 two-parter Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie represents the closest the show came to committing to the evil genius premise in a sustained and serious way, and then the simulation twist undid it. The decision to resolve that story with a reset was a choice made by specific writers in a specific moment, and it was the wrong choice in hindsight. Not because shock endings are inherently bad, but because the story that the two episodes were telling was one that the audience had been waiting for since the pilot, and resolving it with a reset said clearly that the show was never going to let that story actually happen. After that two-parter, the transformation of Stewie accelerated. The evil genius elements became rarer and rarer. The world domination plans, which had been almost weekly in Season 1, became annual at best and then essentially disappeared. The weaponry, the time machine, the elaborate schemes, these persisted as props and plot devices, but they no longer defined the character. They were things Stewie had access to rather than things Stewie was. The version of Stewie who exists from Season 8 onward is genuinely likable. He has real warmth and real vulnerability. His friendship with Brian has produced some of the most emotionally resonant moments the show has ever created, including the bank vault episode that many people consider the show's single best piece of television. These are real accomplishments, but they are the accomplishments of a character who replaced one of the most original characters in animation history, rather than developing him. And the original character's potential, the directions he could have gone if the show had been willing to commit to the harder creative path of taking the evil genius premise somewhere genuinely new, represents one of the most significant lost opportunities in the show's history. Section 15. The Production Mythology Stories from Inside the Machine. Animation is a medium that creates its own mythology as a byproduct of how it works. Because an animated show is made by dozens and eventually hundreds of people, each contributing a specific part of a larger whole, the stories that circulate within a production tend to be specific and vivid, and often impossible to verify from the outside. Who said what in which table read? Which executive gave which note that killed which joke? Which animator worked late to put something in an episode that nobody had approved, and which somehow survived all the review stages and made it to air? Family Guy has more of these stories than most animated shows, partly because it has been running for so long, and partly because its reputation for pushing against network standards has made the behind-the-scenes dynamics particularly interesting to people who follow the show closely. The story of the Road to Rhode Island Osama bin Laden scene is one that MacFarlane has told publicly, both because it connects to a genuinely significant moment in his own life, and because the scene's removal from the episode illustrates the way real-world events can retroactively change the meaning of comedy. The scene was funny when it was made. It was funny in the context of early 2000 television. It became impossible to broadcast in the context of post-September 11 America, and the question of whether it would ever be possible to reinstate it is one that nobody at the production level has seriously entertained. The story of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein being shelved for nearly 4 years is another production mythology story, one that involves Fox's executives reading the episode and deciding that the risk of anti-Semitism accusations outweighed the value of the comedy. MacFarlane's response to the ban, delivered with characteristic dry wit in the introduction to the eventual Adult Swim broadcast, became itself part of the show's mythology. His comment about Fox's tendency to describe things as too risky when they meant anything not involving Paris Hilton on the hood of a car was funny enough and pointed enough that it circulated widely and contributed to the show's reputation as a creative enterprise. In ongoing conflict with its corporate context, the story of Fox airing 3 Family Guy episodes without MacFarlane's permission during the 2007 Writers Guild of America strike is another piece of production mythology that illuminates the relationship between the show's creator and the network that owned it. MacFarlane had joined the picket lines and publicly supported the strike. Fox, which owned the broadcast rights to episodes that had already been completed before the strike began, aired them anyway. MacFarlane was furious. The incident, which he has referenced in interviews, contributed to the deteriorating relationship between creator and network that would eventually lead to MacFarlane's 2020 deal with NBC Universal and his public statements about wanting the show on any network other than Fox. What is interesting about this particular story is what it reveals about the practical limitations of even the most successful television creators' control over their own work. MacFarlane is not a figure without leverage in the entertainment industry. His shows have generated enormous revenue for Fox over more than 2 decades. He is one of the most commercially successful animation producers in the history of the medium. And yet, when Fox decided to air episodes of his show against his explicit wishes during a labor dispute, there was nothing he could do to stop them. The work, once delivered, belonged to the network in a way that the creator could not override. This dynamic, the fundamental power asymmetry between creators and the corporations that distribute their work, is present in most of the interesting stories from the Family Guy production history. The banned episodes are stories about a network deciding that certain content was too risky to broadcast, regardless of what the creative team wanted. The deleted scenes are stories about censors and standards departments drawing lines that the writers then had to work around. The writer's strike story is about the moment when that power asymmetry became impossible to ignore or paper over with commercial success. There is a version of this mythology that is more lighthearted. The stories about individual animators sneaking things into episodes, visual gags and background details, and references so obscure that they require freeze framing to notice, are a different kind of production mythology. They are stories about people taking creative ownership of a tiny corner of a large commercial product and leaving a mark in it that the audience has to actively look for to find. Family Guy fans have documented hundreds of these over the years. Background details that appear in a single frame, visual jokes that are only visible if you happen to pause the episode at exactly the right moment, references to obscure pieces of pop culture that were included by a specific animator who wanted to share something they loved. These are not exactly deleted content. They made it to air, but they are a kind of parallel content, things that exist in the broadcast version of the show but that most viewers will never see because most viewers do not watch at a level of attention that would reveal them. They are the show's hidden layer, the version of it that rewards the most devoted viewers with details that were put there specifically for them. The mythology of the production also includes the stories about what the show saved for DVD releases and what it held back. The Season 4 DVD release was the first one produced with the explicit intention of including deleted scenes and other extras as a way of adding value to the home release in the era when DVD sales were a significant revenue stream for entertainment companies. The approach worked commercially. It also created an incentive structure that meant certain content was produced for the DVD rather than for broadcast, material that was never intended to air but which was made to give home release buyers something extra. This is a different relationship with deleted content than the one that governed the first 3 seasons. In the early seasons, things were cut because they needed to be cut, not because anyone was thinking strategically about the value of archiving deleted content for later release. From Season 4 onward, the relationship between production and deletion was more complicated, because the deletion itself became a commercial calculation rather than simply a creative or regulatory one. Section 16. The characters who almost existed. Every long-running show generates characters who were created, appeared briefly, and then disappeared. Some of them disappear because they did not work. Some disappear because the storyline they were created for ended. Some disappear for reasons that nobody remembers clearly enough to articulate. And some disappear because they were connected to a version of the show's creative direction that got abandoned before it was fully realized. Family Guy has its share of all of these. But the category that is most interesting from a historical perspective is the characters who were planned for more significant roles and then did not get them. Meg's Social World is a good example of this. In the early seasons, Meg had a small group of friends who appeared briefly and then faded. There were plans apparently for these friends to become more developed supporting characters, to give Meg a genuine social context rather than simply the context of being rejected by the social world she wanted to inhabit. These plans were abandoned as the show's approach to Meg shifted from boring normal teenager to target of sustained abuse. Because a character who has real friends and a real social life outside her family is a harder character to victimize for laughs. The friends faded and Meg's isolation became more complete and more comedically useful in the specific dark way the later seasons used her. The character of Death, who appeared in the first season finale and in a handful of subsequent episodes, was apparently being developed for a more significant recurring role before the show decided it was not a direction it wanted to commit to. Death in the Family Guy universe is a recognizable Grim Reaper figure played partly as a bureaucratic functionary and partly as a genuine supernatural force. And the show's early experiments with using him as a recurring character produced some interesting moments. But he never became a consistent presence, and the storylines that would have given him that consistency were not pursued. The Mayor of Quahog, portrayed for most of the show's run by Adam West, was a character who accumulated mythology across many seasons and who was used in ways that were often genuinely funny but rarely given the kind of sustained development that would have made him more than an occasional guest figure. West's death in 2017 created a situation the show handled by replacing the character with a new mayor rather than recasting Adam West's version, which was a decision that acknowledged the inseparability of the character from the actor who voiced him. But it also means that the Adam West version of the mayor exists as a character who was never quite as fully realized as the show's affection for the concept suggested he could have been. There are also the characters who appear in fan-beloved episodes and then simply do not recur. The Conway Twitty appearances, whatever you think of them as comedy, created a kind of character-adjacent presence in the show that has a mythology in the fan community even though Twitty himself was not a fictional creation. The show's use of real people, or rather the show's use of recordings and footage of real people in contexts that the real people did not specifically consent to in the usual sense, is a specific production quirk that has its own complicated relationship with what it means for someone to be in Family Guy. Section 17. The show inside the show, television within television. One of Family Guy's most persistent creative preoccupations is television itself. The show is deeply, almost obsessively interested in broadcast television as a cultural artifact, as a business, as a creative medium, and as a historical record of how American culture has represented itself to itself. The cutaway format, whatever its creative limitations, is fundamentally a format about television, about the way that television in the era that Peter Griffin is nostalgic for existed as a continuous stream of references to other things that existed on other televisions. The show within the show has taken many forms across its history. The most formal version is Peter's cable access channel in the PTV episode, where Peter creates original programming and broadcasts deleted content from the show's own history. But the impulse toward representing other television programs, real or fictional, runs throughout the show's entire run in ways that are more pervasive than any single episode. The cutaway gags themselves are very often structured as brief television programs. A character will reference something, and then the show will cut to what appears to be a clip from a different kind of television, an 80s sitcom or a nature documentary or a newscast or a celebrity interview, delivered in a format that mimics the conventions of those genres closely enough to be recognizable. The comedy in these moments often derives from the gap between the genre conventions being evoked and the content being placed within them. This is not a trivial creative choice. It reflects a specific understanding of how the show's audience experiences television, an understanding that was particularly accurate for the late 1990s and early 2000s, When the show's core demographic had grown up watching an enormous volume of television and had internalized its genre conventions deeply enough to recognize and appreciate the jokes that came from violating those conventions. Family Guy was, in this sense, a show about being a television viewer as much as it was a show about a family. The deleted content from this angle includes cutaway gags that were written for specific episodes and then cut, gags that were genre parodies of specific programs or categories of programming that did not make it into the final cut for various reasons. Some of these survive on DVD extras. Others exist only in scripts or table read transcripts that are not publicly available. The pattern of what gets cut from the cutaway gags is interesting when you can see it, because it reveals which specific genre references were considered too obscure, or too dated, or too niche for the audience the show was trying to reach at any given moment. The show's relationship with The Simpsons is worth its own consideration here. Family Guy and The Simpsons exist on the same network and have, across their parallel histories, acknowledged each other in various ways ranging from warm crossover affection to pointed competitive commentary. The 2014 crossover episode The Simpsons Guy put the two families in the same story and was watched by millions of people who had been following both shows for years. But the more interesting relationship is the one that exists in the things neither show has chosen to say directly. Family Guy was frequently compared to The Simpsons in its early years, a comparison the show itself addressed in various self-aware ways. The accusation that Family Guy was derivative of The Simpsons was a recurring critical complaint that MacFarlane pushed back against, arguing that the shows shared a format but not an approach. And the evidence largely supports this. The shows are structurally similar in using a nuclear family in a specific American town as the basis for a half-hour animated comedy, but they approach character, continuity, and humor in meaningfully different ways. What was deleted from the Family Guy record in this specific area includes various jokes and references to The Simpsons that were written and then cut, partly because the network was not always comfortable with one of its shows making pointed jokes at the expense of another, and partly because the creative team was genuinely ambivalent about the comparison and did not always want to invite it by acknowledging it too directly. Section 18. The ASMR quality of the Griffin family home. There is something that fans of the show have articulated in various ways over the years without always having a clean vocabulary for it, which is that the domestic spaces of Family Guy have a specific sensory quality that contributes to the show's unusual effectiveness as background television. The Griffin house, with its particular color palette and its specific arrangement of rooms that the show has depicted from dozens of angles across hundreds of episodes, has become one of the most familiar built environments in animated television. The living room with its brown couch and its television and its slightly chaotic arrangement of furniture that somehow always works as a composition. The kitchen where Lois spends a significant portion of her screen time with its particular warmth and its organized enough clutter. Stewie's bedroom, which contains advanced weapons technology alongside the ordinary accoutrements of a baby's room, and which is, when you think about it, one of the more extraordinary domestic spaces in fiction. Brian's corner of the house, wherever that happens to be in a given episode. The basement where various things have happened over the years, the backyard where more things have happened, the stairs where the family has had countless brief exchanges that the show uses to transition between scenes. The Griffin house is not just a setting. It is a character in the sense that familiar spaces become characters in long-running fiction, accumulating associations and memories and the particular resonance of things that have happened there. When something significant happens in the Griffin kitchen, it happens against the background of every other significant thing that has ever happened in the Griffin kitchen. The space carries the weight of its history even when the show does not explicitly acknowledge that history. This is part of why Family Guy works as comforting background viewing, in ways that the show's surface-level content does not obviously suggest it should. The show is often crude and often dark, and often structured around humor that requires attention to land properly. But the environments it takes place in are deeply, repeatedly familiar. The Griffin family home is a space that regular viewers know as well as they know their own homes, and there is a comfort in that familiarity that operates below the level of the specific jokes and storylines. The deleted scenes and cut content tend to take place in these same familiar spaces. When a scene gets cut from an episode, it usually gets cut from a location that the viewer already knows. The scene shows characters doing something in the kitchen that did not make the final edit, or having a conversation on the couch that the pacing of the final episode did not have room for. The absent content feels absent against a background that is present, and that creates a specific kind of loss that is different from the loss of content set in locations you have never seen. The sensory quality of the show's domestic spaces also connects to the specific experience of watching Family Guy late at night, which is how a significant portion of its audience has always encountered it. Late-night television is a different experience than primetime television. The attention is softer. The tolerance for darkness is higher. The desire for something that is familiar and warm, even when it is edgy or crude, is more pronounced. Family Guy's combination of genuinely dark humor and deeply familiar domestic spaces was well suited to this viewing context from the beginning, and the Adult Swim reruns that saved the show from cancellation were partly successful because they reached viewers in exactly that late-night state. The missing content exists in a kind of shadow domestic space, a version of the Griffin house where scenes that were filmed and then cut are still somehow present. Not visible, but present. The same way that any space holds the residue of what happened in it, even after the furniture has been moved and the people have left. Section 19. What 26 seasons actually means. 26 seasons is a number that does not mean much unless you break it down into something you can hold. It means roughly 26 years of production, though the show has not aired continuously across that span. It means more than 400 episodes of television, each of which was produced by a team of writers, voice actors, animators, directors, composers, and network executives. It means millions of words of dialogue spoken by characters that most viewers know as well as they know real people. It means tens of thousands of jokes, ranging from the brilliant to the terrible, with the full spectrum in between represented across every season. For context, the entirety of the original Star Trek series ran for 3 seasons and 79 episodes. The entire run of Seinfeld, one of the most celebrated comedies in television history, was 9 seasons and 180 episodes. The Sopranos, which changed prestige television permanently, ran for 6 seasons and 86 episodes. Family Guy has nearly doubled the episode count of all of these and is still going. What 26 seasons means for the question of deleted content and lost storylines is that the volume of material produced but not broadcast is itself enormous. If the show's production generated, conservatively, 15 to 20% more material than it aired, the deleted archive would represent dozens of additional episodes worth of content, scattered across more than 2 decades of production in formats and on media that have changed dramatically over that period. The early deleted content was produced on formats that are now obsolete. The more recent content is probably on digital systems that are more stable, but the sheer volume of material and the organizational challenges of a production of this scale mean that a certain percentage of it has simply been lost. There is also the question of what 26 seasons means for the show's relationship with its own creative ambition. A show that runs for 26 seasons is a different kind of creative object than one that runs for 3 or 4. It is a show that has been forced to reinvent itself multiple times simply to sustain existence. It has been through writer strikes and network battles and creative leadership changes and shifts in the media landscape that nobody anticipated when it premiered in 1999. It has adapted and adjusted and sometimes compromised, and sometimes held firm on things that mattered. And across all of that, it has continued to generate content, some of which was extraordinary and some of which was terrible and most of which was somewhere in between. The deleted content from 26 seasons represents a range that mirrors the broadcast content. Some of it was deleted because it was not good enough. Some of it was deleted because it was too good, too sharp, too precise, too willing to engage with something the network was not comfortable with. Some of it was deleted for reasons that have nothing to do with quality in either direction. And some of it was deleted by accident, by the passage of time and the limitations of archival practices in a medium that was figuring out its own relationship with preservation as it went. The show will continue generating this archive. Each new season adds more to the record of things that were made and not broadcast, things that were cut and things that were changed. The agreement announced in April 2025, which extends the show through season 27 and into the 2028 to 2029 television season, ensures that this process will continue for at least several more years. By the time Family Guy reaches its 30th anniversary in 2029, if the current renewal holds, it will have produced something like 420 to 430 broadcast episodes. The deleted archive, if it could be assembled and made viewable, would add substantially to that number. The question of what all of it, broadcast and deleted together, actually represents as an artistic and cultural object is one that nobody has quite answered. It is too large to hold all at once. It is too long to watch in any sustained way. It is too inconsistent to evaluate against a single standard. And it is too pervasive in the cultural memory of the past quarter century to dismiss as unimportant. What it is, in the end, is a record. An imperfect, partial, sometimes fascinating and sometimes frustrating record of what a specific group of creative people, working within a specific set of commercial and regulatory constraints, were thinking about and trying to do across a very long stretch of time. The parts of that record that are publicly available are the parts that survived all the filters. The parts that are not available are the parts that did not. Both sets of material are real. Both sets of material have value, and the gap between them, the space where everything that was made but not broadcast lives, is where the most interesting questions about the show actually reside. Section 20. The final mystery: what Family Guy actually is. There is a question that sits underneath all the specific mysteries and deleted scenes and fan theories and censorship battles and writer room stories that have been the subject of this entire piece. And the question is a simple one, though it is harder to answer cleanly than it sounds. What is Family Guy? The surface answer is obvious. It is an animated television comedy created by Seth MacFarlane, featuring the Griffin family, produced by 20th Television and broadcast on Fox. It premiered in 1999 and has been running, with interruptions, for 26 years. But that answer does not actually account for what the show has been. It has been a cultural phenomenon and a source of genuine innovation in comedy and a document of a specific moment in American media history and a creative entity that has changed substantially from its origins, while retaining enough continuity that the same name and the same characters connect across a vast span of time. It has been a show that made people laugh in ways they had not been made to laugh before, and a show that made people uncomfortable in ways they were not always sure they wanted to be uncomfortable. It has been a show about a family, and a show about television, and a show about the relationship between comedy and power, and a show about nothing in particular, depending on which episode you were watching and what you brought to it. The deleted content complicates the surface answer in a specific way. A show is not just what was broadcast. It is the full set of creative choices made in its production, including the choices about what to cut and what to change and what not to make. The shadow archive of Family Guy, everything that was produced but not broadcast and everything that was discussed but not produced, is part of what the show is in a meaningful sense. The decisions that created the shadow archive are decisions that shaped the show that exists, because the things that were cut out affected what remained, and the things that were not made affected the directions the show could have gone. The fan theories that reframe the show, the purgatory theory and the multiverse theory and the Peter going insane theory, are also part of what the show is, in the sense that a work of fiction includes the interpretive frameworks that audiences apply to it. Family Guy has generated these frameworks in abundance, which tells you something about what the show actually does to its audience. It creates enough complexity and enough unresolved questions to sustain a robust interpretive community across decades of viewing. The banned episodes are part of what the show is in the sense that a creative entity is partly defined by what it was not allowed to be. The fact that partial terms of endearment was never allowed to air in America is a fact about Family Guy as much as any episode that did air. The creative choice to engage seriously with a divisive topic, the network's choice to suppress that engagement, the continued existence of the episode in a limbo of accessibility that makes it effectively invisible to most of the show's audience, all of this is part of the show's identity. The unanswered questions about Stewie and Brian and the show's internal reality are part of what the show is, in the sense that mysteries maintained across 26 years become structural features rather than temporary apps in the narrative. The show is partly constituted by its own refusal to answer certain questions. It knows that you want to know who can hear Stewie and what Brian actually is and what the Griffin family's world is actually like at the level of its physics and metaphysics. It has chosen not to tell you, and that choice is as deliberate as anything else the show has ever done. What Family Guy actually is, after all of this, is a show that has made itself very difficult to know completely. It has multiple banned versions and an extensive shadow archive, and a community of people who have spent considerable energy trying to understand it beyond what the broadcast record contains. It has internal mysteries that its own creator has declined to resolve. It has an archive of deleted content that is partly documented and mostly inaccessible. It has been interpreted and reinterpreted by people who care deeply about what it means, reaching conclusions that the show itself has never endorsed or refuted. A show like this is not the kind of thing you finish watching. You watch the episodes that are available, and then you find the ones that are harder to access, and then you read about the ones that cannot be found, and then you encounter the theories that reframe the ones you have already watched, and then you go back and watch them again with different eyes. And somewhere in that process, the show you thought you knew becomes something larger and stranger and more interesting than you expected it to be. The thing that got pulled before it aired, the episode that never aired in America, the scene that was cut after an event in the real world made it impossible to broadcast, the storyline that was discussed and abandoned, the question that has been open for 26 years and shows no sign of being answered, the version of the character that could have existed if different decisions had been made at different points. All of it is Family Guy. The stuff you watched and the stuff you could not watch and the stuff that was never made. The complete version of the show includes everything, and the complete version is the one that will never quite be assembled in full, which is exactly the kind of ending a show built on cutaway gags that sometimes never get resolved would have chosen for itself if it had gotten to choose. Thank you for spending this time here. Leave a like if any part of this landed for you, and subscribe for more of this kind of long, quiet, detailed storytelling. Sleep well. Bonus section. The deep cuts, lesser-known, deleted scenes, and the lore they contain. There is a specific and pleasurable exhaustion that comes from spending time in the deep archive of any long-running show. You start with the famous things, the banned episodes, the scenes everyone has heard about, and then you find yourself in the territory of the things that only the most devoted fans know existed. A background gag that appeared in a single frame of a Season 4 episode and was never referenced again. A piece of dialogue in a DVD deleted scene that recontextualizes a character relationship in a way that the broadcast version never addressed. A voice actor credit in an episode's end credits for a character who never appears in the episode that was broadcast, suggesting that scenes featuring that character were cut during post-production. The Family Guy fandom has been cataloging this material for over 20 years, and the document it has produced is one of the more impressive pieces of collaborative archiving in the history of television fan communities. It is imperfect and sometimes contradictory, and occasionally based on misidentified or misattributed footage. But it is also genuinely valuable as a record of what the show has been across its run in ways that the official production record does not capture. One of the more interesting categories of deep archive material is what fans call animatics, the rough preliminary animation that precedes the fully rendered version of any animated scene. Animatics are technically animation, in the sense that they are images in sequence that create the illusion of movement, but they are deliberately rough, usually presented in a limited color palette with incomplete backgrounds and character designs that are close to the final version but not polished. They are the version of the animation that the creative team uses to evaluate timing and pacing before committing to the expense of full animation. For Family Guy, animatics of scenes that were subsequently cut represent a category of deleted content that is slightly different from the full-color deleted scenes. They are earlier in the production process, which means they were cut before the production invested fully in them. But they are also often more revealing about the creative process because the roughness of the format strips away the finish that the final version would have had and leaves the underlying idea more visible. Some Family Guy animatics have surfaced over the years, shared by fans who obtained them through various channels. The Lost Media Wiki has documented several of these, with appropriate notes about the uncertainty around their provenance and the difficulty of verifying their authenticity. What they show, in the cases where they can be verified, is the range of material that was being considered during the production of specific episodes. Some of the animatics depict scenes that are very close to the broadcast version, with only minor timing differences. Others depict scenes that are substantially different from anything in the final cut, suggesting that the episode went through significant revision between the animatic stage and the final broadcast. The deleted scenes available on DVD represent a different point in the production process, usually scenes that were fully animated and then cut during editing. The difference between an animatic of a cutscene and a fully animated deleted scene is the difference between something that was stopped early and something that was completed and then removed. Both tell you something interesting about the show's creative process, but they tell you different things. The animatics reveal what the show was thinking about doing. The full deleted scenes reveal what the show actually did before deciding not to include it. One of the most documented categories of full deleted scenes is the extended character moments that got cut because they slowed the pacing of an episode rather than because they were flagged for content. These are scenes where a character reveals something about themselves that complicates the simpler version of that character the broadcast episode presents. Extended versions of conversations between Peter and Lois where the warmth between them is more visible than in the cut version. Scenes where Brian articulates something about his own situation that the broadcast version only gestures toward. Moments where Meg is given a beat that acknowledges her perspective in a way that the final edit does not have room for. These scenes do not change the fundamental story of any episode they were cut from. They were cut because the episode worked without them, and in the mechanics of broadcast television, if something can be cut and the episode still works, the incentive is to cut it. But they accumulate into a portrait of the characters that is slightly more generous than the broadcast version, slightly more interested in who these people are when nobody is asking them to be funny. And that portrait, assembled from dozens of scenes across dozens of seasons, is one of the most interesting things the shadow archive of the show contains. There are also the scenes that were cut specifically because the show was trying to manage its own tonal consistency, scenes that were too dark for an episode that was otherwise lighter or too sincere for an episode that needed to land as pure comedy. The show has always had a complicated relationship with sincerity. In the early seasons, the warmth was present but usually embedded in enough comedy to keep it from feeling like an anomaly. In the later seasons, the show has oscillated between moments of genuine emotional depth and episodes that are almost entirely committed to shock and absurdism, and the management of that tonal range has produced cuts that go in both directions. Some deleted scenes were cut because they were not funny enough in a comedy. Others were cut because they were too sincere in a show that was trying to maintain its irreverent reputation. The content that falls into the second category is, in some ways, the most poignant part of the Shadow Archive. It represents the version of Family Guy that wanted to take its characters seriously more consistently than the broadcast version allowed it to. The deep archive of deleted scenes also includes material that was cut for reasons that have nothing to do with the content itself. Scenes that were technically flawed in some way that the production could not afford to correct. Scenes that worked in isolation but that disrupted the flow of the episode around them. Scenes that contained jokes that were topical at the time of production but that dated between when they were written and when the episode aired. Which is a particular risk for a show that MacFarlane acknowledged takes about 10 months to a year to produce each episode. The 10-month to 1-year production timeline is itself a significant factor in the show's relationship with deleted content. A joke written in the room in January needs to still be funny in November when the episode airs. A cultural reference that is timely in the writer's room may be stale or incomprehensible by broadcast. A news event that shapes a storyline may have been overtaken by subsequent events by the time the episode reaches the audience. The show manages this by writing material that is either timeless enough to survive the gap or specific enough to a character's established worldview rather than to current events. But the cuts that happen because something dated between production and broadcast are a specific and interesting category of deletion. The Boston Marathon sequence in Turban Cowboy represents the most extreme version of this phenomenon. In that case, it was not that the joke dated. It was that reality caught up to it in a way that transformed its meaning entirely. But the more ordinary version of this problem, where a joke that was timely in the writer's room becomes stale or muted by the time it airs, produces a steady stream of cuts and modifications that are part of the normal production rhythm for a show with a year-long production cycle. A closing meditation on what gets kept. Let us end where we started, in the Shadow Archive. In the space where everything the show created but did not broadcast lives alongside everything it created and did broadcast, in whatever form any of it survives. There is a specific quality of attention that the best of Family Guy asks of its audience. The show at its best is dense with things that reward noticing. References buried in backgrounds, jokes that require a specific cultural context to land. Moments of genuine character depth embedded in episodes that are primarily constructed for laughs. The cutaway format, for all the criticism it received for replacing storytelling with randomness, was at its best a format that required the audience to hold multiple things in mind simultaneously. The main story, the cutaway, and the connection between them that the show was assuming you could make. This quality of requiring active engagement from the audience is part of what has sustained the fan community around the show for over 2 decades. A show that you can watch passively and extract reasonable entertainment from is not a show that generates the kind of passionate, detailed, argumentative engagement that Family Guy has generated. The arguments about which seasons were good and which were bad, the theories about what the show's world actually is, the documentation of deleted content and lost media, all of this activity requires a baseline of caring that passive entertainment does not produce. The people who care about what got cut from Family Guy care because they care about what the show is and what it was trying to do. They care about the relationship between the version that was broadcast and the version that was made. They care about the gap between the characters as they appeared on screen and the characters as they might have been if different decisions had been made in different rooms at different points across 26 years of production. That gap is the most interesting thing about the Shadow Archive. Not the specific content of any individual scene or storyline, but the aggregate shape of the difference between what was made and what was shown. That shape tells you something about the pressures the show was under, the constraints it was working within, and the compromises it made along the way. It tells you something about the relationship between creative ambition and commercial reality in broadcast television. It tells you something about the specific historical moment the show was made in, and the ways that moment shaped what was acceptable and what was not. And it tells you something about the show itself, about what it was trying to be and what it was prevented from being, and what it chose not to be when it had the choice. All three of these categories are present in the Shadow Archive. Things that were cut against the creative team's wishes, things that were cut by the network over the creative team's objections, things that were cut because the creative team itself decided, for whatever reason, that they should not be part of the show. The last category is the most interesting, in a way, because it represents the show making judgments about itself, deciding that certain things did not belong in the version of itself it wanted to present to the world. Those judgments are not always visible from the outside, but they shaped what exists, and understanding what the show chose not to show is part of understanding what it chose to show. Family Guy, at the end of 26 seasons, is a show that has accumulated more of its own history than most creative projects ever get the chance to accumulate. The history is visible in the broadcast record, and it is also visible in fragments and traces and documented absences in the Shadow Archive that runs parallel to the broadcast record. Both records are part of what the show is. Neither one is complete. And the gap between them, the space where everything that was made but not shown lives, is where the most honest version of the show's story actually exists. It is quiet there, in that gap, like a house after everyone has gone to sleep. The furniture is still in place and the spaces are still familiar, and somewhere in the walls and the floors and the ordinary domestic air there is the residue of everything that happened here. Most of it will never be seen. Some of it will surface, eventually, when someone looks in the right place at the right time. A scene on an old hard drive, a description in an interview that nobody has quite noticed before, a frame in a piece of archival footage that contains a moment the broadcast version cut, and the people who are looking for these things will find them, or they will not. And the record will be a little more complete, or it will stay exactly as incomplete as it has always been. Either way, the search is worth it. Either way, the show is worth caring about this much. Thank you for being here. Leave a like, subscribe if you have not already, and drop a comment telling me what time and place you're watching from. I read every single one. Sleep well. Extended deep dive. The Quagmire Problem and what it reveals about deleted storylines. Glenn Quagmire is one of the most complicated characters in the Family Guy universe, and one of the most complicated cases of a character whose deleted and underdeveloped content illuminates the tensions within the show's own creative identity in ways that the broadcast material alone cannot fully explain. On the surface, Quagmire is the show's designated sex-obsessed neighbor, a pilot who has slept with an implausible number of women and whose entire comedic function in most episodes is to express extreme, cartoonishly inappropriate sexual desire. His catchphrase, the single-syllable giggity, became one of the show's most recognized pieces of vernacular, the kind of thing that entered the language of people who had never seen the show simply through osmosis. As comedy shorthand, Quagmire works extremely well at the level of the surface. But the surface is not all of it, and the deeper you go into the character's history, the more complicated and interesting and ultimately frustrating the picture becomes. The Season 8 episode, Jerome is the New Black, is the episode that most fans point to when they discuss Quagmire's depth as a character, and the specific scene within it that is most often referenced is Quagmire's speech to Brian. In this speech, Quagmire articulates in clear and specific terms why he dislikes Brian Griffin. He calls Brian out as a phony who dresses up intellectual pretension as actual intelligence. He calls Brian out for his failed writing career, his political soapboxing, his habitual drinking, and his pattern of hitting on Peter's wife in front of Peter. He calls Brian out for being a bad father who abandoned his own son. He calls Brian out for being, in Quagmire's assessment, precisely the kind of person that Brian himself would claim to despise. The speech is remarkable for several reasons. First, because it is completely accurate. Everything Quagmire says is backed by specific episodes and specific scenes. He is not making it up. He is not being unfair. He is delivering a precise critique of Brian Griffin's character that the audience has been developing for themselves over many seasons of watching Brian behave in the ways Quagmire is describing. Second, because it comes from Quagmire, the character whose entire function for most of the show's run is to be a cartoonishly inappropriate sexual predator, delivers the show's most psychologically astute piece of character analysis. The show, in giving Quagmire this speech, reveals that there is something behind the one-note comedy, something that understands people and can read them clearly, and then uses this understanding to land the speech with devastating accuracy. Third, because the show does nothing with it. Brian does not change. The speech does not produce any lasting shift in Brian's behavior or in the relationship between the two characters. The next episode, everything is essentially back to the same configuration. The speech is a peak of psychological clarity in a show that generally does not deal in psychological clarity, and it passes without consequence. The deleted content around Quagmire includes scenes that develop this side of the character further, that give him more interiority and more emotional complexity than the broadcast version of most episodes allows. On DVD extras and in various fan-documented sources, there are deleted scenes where Quagmire expresses genuine care for Peter in ways that the broadcast version usually buries under the next joke. There are scenes where his war veteran status, a detail the show has acknowledged and then generally not developed, is given more attention. There are moments where the gap between the character as comedy function and the character as person is smaller than in the broadcast version. Quagmire has a backstory that the show has assembled piecemeal across many seasons, without ever fully committing to it as the foundation of a character arc. He is a Navy-trained pilot with considerable mechanical and tactical skills. His family history is complicated and painful, including the revelation that his father is a transgender woman, a storyline handled with enough sensitivity that it generated genuine critical discussion alongside the expected controversy. His relationships with women, which the show usually depicts as purely exploitative, have occasionally been shown to involve genuine feeling and genuine hurt when they end badly. The Quagmire that exists in these moments is a character who could have been developed into something significantly more interesting than the one-note sex comedy persona the show has generally settled for. And the deleted content suggests that this development was occasionally attempted and then pulled back from, perhaps because the comedy persona was considered too commercially valuable to complicate, perhaps because the writers were not confident they could sustain the more complex version across the long run of the show. There is a specific deleted storyline involving Quagmire's relationship with his family that was apparently discussed at the writer's room level, but never produced. The details of this storyline have been mentioned in fragmentary ways in various fan community discussions and in a small number of interviews with people who worked on the show during the relevant period, but the specifics are contested enough that they need to be flagged as unverified. What seems clear is that the show considered exploring Quagmire's background in more depth than the single episode featuring his father ever allowed, and that this exploration was set aside in favor of returning the character to his established comedy function. The reason this matters for the broader question of Family Guy's deleted content is that Quagmire represents the clearest example of a supporting character who was given enough material to be genuinely interesting and then not given enough space to fully develop. He is the most extreme version of a pattern that runs throughout the show's treatment of its extended cast, gestures toward complexity that are never sustained, moments of genuine character depth that are immediately followed by a return to the surface level, deleted and undeveloped content that suggests the show knew what it could do with these characters and chose not to do it. The show's treatment of its ensemble is, in this sense, one of the most significant sources of the gap between what was made and what was broadcast. The main cast, Peter and Lois and Brian and Stewie and Meg and Chris, have received enough screen time over 26 seasons that their complexity, such as it is, has been developed even through inconsistency. The supporting cast, the Joe Swansons and Quagmires and Clevelands and Herberts and Mayor Wests, have been given enough to suggest what fully developed versions of them might look like, and then generally not given the sustained attention that would produce those versions. The deleted content around these characters tends to be the material that was moving toward fuller development before being pulled back. And the cumulative weight of all this material, the sum of all the scenes that moved toward complexity and were then cut, represents one of the most interesting gaps in the show's public record. Extended analysis. The Brian and Stewie relationship as the show's hidden spine. There is a case to be made, and the fan community has been making it in various forms for years, that the true emotional center of Family Guy has never been the Griffin family as a unit, or Peter and Lois as a couple, or any of the other family configurations the show presents. The true emotional center has been the friendship between Brian and Stewie. This is not an obvious thing to say about a show that is ostensibly about a nuclear family, but the evidence for it is extensive. The Brian and Stewie relationship is the one that has generated the show's most praised pieces of television. The bottle episode Brian and Stewie from Season 8, in which the two are locked in a bank vault and have honest conversations about their lives and their fears, is widely regarded as the best single episode the show has produced in its revival era. The Road to episodes, which began with Road to Rhode Island in Season 2 and have continued across the show's entire run, represent the show's most consistent creative success across any extended period. The deleted content around the Brian and Stewie relationship is, correspondingly, some of the most interesting material in the show's shadow archive. There are deleted scenes from Road to episodes that develop specific moments in the relationship that the broadcast versions did not have room for. There are extended versions of conversations between the two characters that the broadcast versions cut for pacing. There are animatics that suggest Road to adventures that were planned but never produced, directions the relationship could have gone that were considered and then set aside. The Road to series itself represents an interesting case of an abandoned creative direction. The series has continued across many seasons, but the episodes have not all been produced with equal investment or equal creative ambition. Some of the later Road to episodes have been criticized for relying on the formula without bringing anything new to it. And the original Road to episodes, particularly Road to Rhode Island and its immediate successors, represent a version of the format that was willing to take the characters somewhere genuinely unexpected. The deleted material from these early episodes suggests that the creative team was considering even more ambitious versions of some of the storylines that made it to air. The extended version of the therapy scene in Road to Rhode Island is the most documented example, but it is not the only one. There are references in fan community sources to cut moments from Road to Europe and Road to Rupert that would have developed specific emotional beats in ways the broadcast versions did not pursue. What the accumulation of all this material suggests is that the Brian and Stewie relationship has always been the part of the show where the writers were most willing to take creative risks, and where those risks were most likely to produce material worth watching. It is the relationship that generated the bottle episode. It is the relationship that generated Christmas Guy, the episode where Stewie uses time travel to save Brian's life after his death in Life of Brian, and which is, in the fan community's assessment, one of the genuinely moving pieces of television the show has produced in any era. The deleted content around this relationship tends to be material that was moving toward even more emotional honesty than the broadcast versions allowed. Scenes where Brian's vulnerability is more directly expressed. Moments where Stewie's affection for Brian is stated rather than implied. Exchanges that explore the fundamental strangeness of the relationship between a talking dog and an evil genius baby in ways that the comedy format sometimes does not have room for. The Brian and Stewie bottle episode is the clearest example of what the show can do when it commits fully to exploring this relationship without the usual comedy scaffolding. And the deleted content around that episode and others in the series suggests that the impulse toward that kind of honesty was present across many more episodes than the broadcast record shows. It was present and then managed, cut for pacing or for tonal consistency or simply because the show needed to get back to the jokes and did not have room for the quieter material that the relationship was generating. The result is a broadcast record that shows the best moments of the Brian and Stewie relationship, while the deleted archive contains many of the more ordinary moments, The conversations that were not dramatic enough to carry an episode, but that built the foundation of the friendship across many seasons. Both kinds of material are necessary for the relationship to feel real. The absence of the ordinary moments from the broadcast version is part of why the relationship sometimes feels like it exists only in its peaks, only in the episodes where it is explicitly the focus, without the connecting tissue of smaller moments that would give it the texture of something lived rather than something performed. The Accidental Archive. What YouTube and the Internet preserved. In 2005, the same year Family Guy returned from its second cancellation, YouTube launched. The coincidence of timing is significant. Family Guy came back from the dead into a world that had just invented the infrastructure for clipping, sharing, and archiving video content in ways that had no precedent. The show's cutaway format, which had always been structurally self-contained in a way that made individual gags easy to isolate, turned out to be perfectly suited to the clip culture that YouTube was in the process of creating. The clips that circulated most widely were the funniest, self-contained moments from the show, scenes and gags that could be watched independently without needing to know anything about the surrounding episode. These clips accumulated millions of views, introduced the show to audiences who had never watched it through conventional broadcast, and created a kind of parallel archive of the show's most shareable moments that existed independently of any official broadcast or home release. But YouTube and the Internet more broadly also became a repository for something else. Material that was not supposed to exist in publicly shareable form. Deleted scenes that had been included on DVD extras and then ripped and uploaded. Fan edits that combined broadcast footage with DVD bonus material to create extended versions of episodes. The occasional piece of footage that came from sources that were harder to identify. Material that circulated without clear attribution and whose origins were contested in fan community discussions. This accidental internet archive has preserved things that might otherwise have been much harder to access. The Osama bin Laden scene from Road to Rhode Island is documented in fan communities partly because early YouTube uploads of the clips circulated before the platform's content moderation caught up with the sensitivity concerns. The extended versions of certain DVD scenes circulated in video form before physical DVDs became less common as the primary format for home entertainment. The animatics and rough cuts that have surfaced over the years often circulated on early video sharing platforms before migrating to more specialized archival spaces. The Internet Archive is imperfect in the ways that any informal archive is imperfect. Attribution is unreliable. Provenance is contested. The line between legitimate deleted scenes from official sources and content created by fans and misrepresented as official is not always clear. And the platform policies of major video sharing sites have created a situation where content that circulated freely in the early years of internet video sharing has been progressively removed, creating new gaps in the record even as old ones were being partially filled. But the Accidental Internet Archive has also produced something that the official production archive was not producing: a living, active community of people who cared enough about the material to track it down, document it, and argue about it. The Lost Media Wiki, the fan wikis, the Reddit communities, the YouTube channels dedicated to deleted content, all of these represent forms of archiving that are different from official studio archives, but that have produced genuinely valuable documentation. The relationship between the official archive and the fan archive is not always comfortable. Studios have historically been inconsistent about how they respond to fan circulation of deleted and unreleased material. Sometimes they ignore it, reasoning that the fan community is providing free publicity. Sometimes they pursue takedowns, reasoning that the material is their property and should not be circulated without authorization. Family Guy has experienced both responses at different points in its history, and the result is an internet record that is more fragmented and more contested than it would be if either side had established a consistent approach. What the Accidental Internet Archive has preserved, in spite of all this complexity, is a body of evidence about what the show has been that goes beyond what the official record contains. It is evidence that required people to care enough to document it, which tells you something about the depth of the audience's investment in the show across its history. People who do not care deeply about something do not spend years tracking down its deleted scenes and arguing about their provenance and building detailed wikis documenting what exists and what does not. The Family Guy that exists in the fan archive, with all its complications and contradictions and contested materials, is a version of the show that is in some ways truer to the full scope of what the show has been than the official broadcast record alone. It includes the things that were made and suppressed. It includes the debates about what happened and why. It includes the community of people who have been watching and caring and arguing about the show across decades. And it includes, somewhere in its depths, material that has not been seen by most people and that may never be widely seen, but that is part of the record nonetheless. That record, in its imperfect and ongoing form, is the Shadow Archive at its fullest extension. Not just the deleted scenes on DVD extras, not just the banned episodes in accessible formats, but the entire mass of documentation and discussion and preserved footage and fan memory that has accumulated around the show across 26 years of people caring about it enough to look for everything they could find. It is an archive of caring as much as it is an archive of content. And in the end, for a show that has generated as much passionate, argumentative, sustained caring as Family Guy has, that might be the most significant archive of all.